They only threw her into the snow because they believed nobody important was watching. The first slap landed softly. That was what Lillian Ashford remembered later. Not the sting. Not the humiliation. The softness of it. Vivian Ashford had always understood that cruelty delivered quietly left deeper bruises than cruelty delivered loudly. The grand ballroom of Ashford Manor glowed gold beneath 3 massive crystal chandeliers imported from Vienna 20 years earlier, back when the Ashford name still carried enough weight to command respect instead of pity. Candlelight flickered against marble columns. A string quartet played near the western staircase. Women in silk gowns drifted across polished floors like painted ghosts, while men in dark formal coats discussed railroads, shipping routes, and political alliances over glasses of bourbon. Outside, snow fell steadily over the estate grounds, covering the gardens and frozen fountains in white silence. Inside, warmth and music hid wrought beautifully. Lillian stood near the edge of the ballroom in a pale silver gown that had belonged to her late mother. The dress was old. The lace around the sleeves had yellowed slightly with age. One small tear near the hem had been carefully repaired by hand 2 nights earlier beneath candlelight after everyone else in the manor had gone to sleep. Vivian had noticed immediately. "You wore that?" her stepmother asked quietly, smiling as guests passed nearby. Her voice sounded pleasant enough to fool strangers. It always did. Lillian lowered her eyes. "It was my mother's." "Exactly." Vivian lifted her champagne glass. Ruby stones glittered at her throat like drops of fresh blood. "You insist on clinging to dead things. It is exhausting." Lillian did not answer. She had learned years ago that silence survived arguments better than honesty ever could. Around them, the annual winter masquerade continued in glittering perfection. Masks of black lace and silver feathers concealed bored expressions and carefully calculated smiles. Lillian recognized nearly every family in attendance. The Whitmores, the Calloways, the Pembrokes, old aristocratic names clinging desperately to old aristocratic power. Most barely noticed her anymore. That had become part of her role inside Ashford Manor. Decorative, quiet, forgettable. Vivian preferred it that way. "There she is," someone whispered nearby. "Poor thing. I heard the Ashfords nearly lost the East property. No dowry either, apparently. Such a shame. She was beautiful when she was younger." Lillian stared at the marble floor and pretended not to hear them. She had spent the past 7 years pretending not to hear many things. The orchestra shifted into another waltz. Vivian smiled brightly at approaching guests before leaning closer to Lillian without moving her lips. "You embarrassed me tonight. I did not mean to. You exist too visibly. That is usually enough." Another soft smile for the guests passing by. Another knife hidden beneath silk. Lillian felt cold suddenly despite the heat inside the ballroom. Her fingers tightened around the stem of her untouched champagne glass. Across the room, laughter erupted near the staircase. Vivian followed the sound with obvious interest. "Lady Pembroke is here." Her eyes sharpened instantly. "And her son." Lillian already understood. Of course she did. Every winter ball carried the same unspoken purpose. Positioning, bargaining, marriage negotiations disguised as entertainment. Vivian had spent months arranging introductions between her own daughter, Clara, and Theodore Pembroke, heir to one of the last truly powerful banking families in New York society. Tonight mattered, which meant Lillian had become inconvenient again. "Go upstairs," Vivian said quietly. Lillian blinked. "The guests have not even..." Now. The smile never left Vivian's face. "You are upsetting Clara." Across the ballroom, Clara Ashford stood near Theodore Pembroke in pale blue satin, laughing softly while several women admired the diamond bracelet around her wrist. She looked radiant beneath the chandeliers. Perfect. Chosen carefully for the role Vivian had spent years preparing her to play. Lillian glanced toward her stepsister only once before lowering her eyes again. "I have done nothing. That has never stopped you from ruining things." The words landed colder than the winter outside. Lillian swallowed carefully. "I only wish to attend for one evening." Vivian finally turned toward her fully. "You are not wanted here." The orchestra continued playing. Guests continued smiling. Nobody noticed the quiet execution taking place beside the ballroom wall. Or perhaps they noticed and simply preferred comfort over intervention. Aristocratic society had always excelled at that. Vivian reached toward Lillian's neckline suddenly. Her fingers closed around the small sapphire pendant hanging there. Lillian stiffened instantly. "Please do not touch that." Vivian's eyes narrowed slightly. "Your mother's necklace." Her fingers tightened. Funny thing about heirlooms. They belong to families, not burdens. It was left to me. According to who? Lillian's heartbeat quickened. My father. Vivian laughed softly. Your father left debts, Lillian. Not treasures. Then she pulled. The delicate silver chain snapped instantly. The pendant struck the marble floor with a sharp crack that somehow sounded louder than the orchestra. Several nearby guests turned. Silence spread outward slowly. Lillian stared downward in horror as the sapphire rolled across polished marble before stopping beside a gentleman's shoe. Theodore Pembroke bent slightly and picked it up. "Is there a problem?" he asked. Vivian sighed dramatically. "Unfortunately." She looked toward the surrounding guests with perfectly measured embarrassment. "My stepdaughter has developed a habit of taking things that do not belong to her." Lillian felt the blood drain from her face. "That is not true." Vivian's expression hardened instantly beneath the mask of social grace. "Do not lie to me in front of guests. The necklace was my mother's. Your mother owned nothing by the time she died." The words cut cleanly. Several women exchanged uncomfortable glances. Nobody stepped forward. Nobody defended her. Of course they did not. Lillian looked around the ballroom slowly. Familiar faces avoided her eyes. Some looked sympathetic. Others merely curious. None looked willing to interfere with Vivian Ashford publicly. Not over a girl with no fortune, no influence, and no place left in society. Vivian extended one gloved hand calmly. "Give me the necklace." Theodore hesitated before placing the pendant into Vivian's palm. Lillian's chest tightened painfully. "Please." Vivian ignored her completely. "You will leave this ballroom immediately." "Vivian." One older woman began carefully. Vivian smiled at her without warmth. "Family matters, Lady Whitmore." The older woman fell silent. Lillian looked at the floor because dignity was sometimes the only possession humiliation could not fully steal. "I did nothing wrong," she whispered. Vivian stepped closer. "You were born wrong." The second slap came harder. Gasps rippled softly through the ballroom. Lillian stumbled backward slightly. Her lips split against the edge of her teeth. Warm blood touched her tongue instantly. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The orchestra had stopped entirely now. Snow hammered softly against the ballroom windows while 200 wealthy guests watched a young woman bleed quietly beneath golden chandeliers. Vivian lowered her hand slowly. "Get out." Lillian remained still for one long second. Her entire body trembled beneath the silver gown. Not from fear. From the effort of remaining composed while something inside her cracked apart silently. Then she bent carefully, gathered the torn edge of her skirt, and walked toward the ballroom doors without another word. The crowd parted for her immediately, not kindly, cautiously, like people stepping aside for an approaching storm they hoped would pass over them untouched. She heard whispers follow her across marble floors. "How awful!" Vivian finally lost patience. The poor girl. She should have known better. Lillian kept walking. Her vision blurred slightly near the entrance hall, though she refused to cry. Not here. Not in front of them. A servant opened the massive front doors reluctantly. Winter air slammed into the manor instantly, sharp enough to steal breath from lungs. Snow swirled violently across the stone steps outside. Lillian stepped into the storm alone. The doors closed behind her with brutal finality. Warmth vanished instantly. Wind tore through her thin evening gloves and tangled loose strands of golden hair across her face. She wrapped her arms around herself automatically and descended the front steps slowly, careful not to slip on the ice gathering beneath fresh snow. The long circular driveway below the manor stood nearly empty except for rows of black carriages and flickering lanterns buried beneath white snowfall. Lillian stopped halfway down the steps when she realized someone was standing near the iron gates at the far edge of the courtyard. A tall man dressed entirely in black. Snow collected across the shoulders of his long wool coat without melting. One gloved hand rested atop a silver-headed cane. He had not moved, had not spoken. He simply watched her from the shadows beyond the lantern light with the stillness of something dangerous enough to never hurry. Lillian could not see his face clearly beneath the storm, but she felt his attention immediately. Heavy, precise, unavoidable. Then the manor doors burst open behind her. Vivian's voice cut through the snow sharply. "Do not come back unless invited." Lillian closed her eyes briefly. The doors slammed shut again. Silence returned except for the wind. Across the courtyard, the man in black finally moved. Slowly, deliberately, a black carriage waited behind him near the gates, enormous beneath falling snow. Two massive horses stamped against frozen ground while lantern light flickered gold across polished wheels. Lillian should have walked away. Every instinct told her to leave before humiliation deepened further. But exhaustion rooted her in place. Cold crept steadily through her thin slippers. Blood from her split lip touched the snow in tiny crimson drops. The man approached without hurry, tall enough to make the storm itself seem smaller around him. When he finally stepped beneath the nearest lantern, Lillian saw hard lines carved into a face that looked built for war instead of ballrooms. Dark hair streaked faintly with silver near the temples. Gray eyes colder than the winter night. A faint scar along his jaw. Duke Rowan Blackthorne. Her breath caught instantly. Even among New York aristocracy, the Blackthorne name carried weight powerful enough to silence rooms. Northern railroads. Shipping empires. Old military contracts. Vast estates hidden in frozen territories where rumors claimed the Duke ruled more like a monarch than a businessman. Dangerous, ruthless, untouchable. And now he stood directly in front of her while snow gathered between them. His eyes lowered briefly to the blood at the corner of her mouth. Something dark flickered across his expression. Not pity, something colder. "Miss Ashford," he said quietly. His voice sounded low enough to belong to the storm itself. Lillian forced herself to straighten despite the cold. "Your Grace." Rowan looked toward the glowing ballroom windows behind her. Music had started again faintly inside. Society continuing exactly as society always did. He turned back toward her slowly. "Who touched you?" Snow swirled between them in sharp white sheets while the lights of Ashford Manor glowed behind Duke Rowan Blackthorne like something distant and unreachable. Lillian could not feel her fingers anymore. Cold had already crept through the thin soles of her slippers and settled deep into her bones. But somehow the weight of his attention unsettled her more than the winter storm ever could. Rowan waited for an answer without moving. He stood perfectly still beneath the falling snow, one hand resting loosely atop the silver head of his cane, while the wind snapped the edges of his black coat around him. The courtyard lanterns flickered gold across hard features carved sharp enough to look dangerous even in silence. "No one," Lillian said finally. Her voice sounded weak against the storm. Rowan's eyes lowered briefly toward the blood at the corner of her mouth again. "That is not true." She swallowed carefully. "It does not matter. It mattered enough to split your lip in front of 200 witnesses." The words landed flat, controlled, somehow colder than anger. Lillian looked away toward the iron gates instead of answering. Snow covered the long driveway already. Beyond the estate walls, the road disappearing into the woods looked dark and endless beneath the storm. She had nowhere to go. The realization settled quietly over her shoulders with almost unbearable weight. 23 years old. No inheritance. No remaining relatives willing to shelter her. No carriage waiting. No future beyond the humiliation she had just walked out of. Inside the manor, music drifted faintly through the walls again. Society continuing without pause. Rowan followed her gaze toward the road. "You cannot walk anywhere in this weather." "I will manage." "In silk slippers?" Lillian looked down automatically. Snow had already soaked through the pale fabric at her feet. She felt suddenly embarrassed by how small and pathetic she must appear standing there bleeding quietly in a ruined silver gown, while one of the most powerful men in New York watched her unravel in silence. I do not require charity, Your Grace. Rowan studied her for one long moment. Good. Her brows pulled together slightly. Because I was not offering charity. Wind swept across the courtyard hard enough to send snow spinning around them again. Somewhere near the stables, horses shifted restlessly against leather harnesses. Lillian wrapped her arms tighter around herself instinctively. Rowan noticed immediately. Of course he did. He seemed like the sort of man who noticed everything. You are freezing. I am fine. No, he said quietly. You are trying very hard to appear fine. The words struck deeper than they should have. Lillian felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. She looked away before he could see it. Men like Rowan Blackthorne did not say things carelessly. Every word sounded deliberate, measured, dangerous in ways she did not fully understand yet. The carriage behind him waited silently beneath falling snow. Massive black horses stamped against the icy ground while lantern light reflected across polished doors marked with the Blackthorn crest in silver. Wolves surrounding a crown. Cold. Predatory. Impossible to ignore. Lillian had heard stories about the Duke for years. Everyone had. Northern rail lines controlled by ruthless contracts. Political rivals destroyed quietly. Business empires built with military precision. A man feared in boardrooms and government halls alike. A man who rarely attended society functions because society adjusted itself around him regardless. And tonight he had witnessed her humiliation from beginning to end. The realization made heat crawl painfully up her neck despite the cold. You should return inside, she said quietly. Rowan did not move. Should I? People will notice your absence. They already have. He glanced once toward the glowing manor windows. I do not particularly care. Lillian stared at him uncertainly. Men like Rowan Blackthorne belonged inside rooms full of crystal chandeliers and political power. Not standing in snow beside disgraced women no one else wanted near them. Why are you here? She asked before she could stop herself. Rowan's gaze returned to her face slowly. At the manor? Anywhere. Something unreadable passed briefly through his expression, then vanished. Business. Lillian almost laughed at the simplicity of the answer. Instead she lowered her eyes again. Of course. Silence settled between them. Not awkward silence. Heavy silence. The kind that seemed to stretch longer because neither person wished to break it first. Snow gathered along Rowan's dark shoulders steadily without melting. He had been standing outside for some time before she noticed him. Watching. Waiting. The thought unsettled her deeply. The front doors of Ashford Manor opened suddenly behind them again. Warm golden light spilled across the snow-covered steps. A young footman hurried down toward Lillian carrying a folded wool cloak. He looked nervous. Miss Ashford, he said carefully. Mrs. Ashford requested that I bring this. Lillian recognized the cloak immediately. One of Clara's old winter wraps. Plain brown wool trimmed with cheap fur. Not kindness. Disposal. Vivian did not wish guests witnessing her stepdaughter freezing to death on the estate steps. The footman hesitated uncertainly beneath Rowan's stare before extending the cloak toward her. Lillian reached for it automatically. Rowan spoke before her fingers touched the fabric. Take it back. The footman froze instantly. Lillian looked up sharply. Rowan's eyes never left the servant. Tell Mrs. Ashford that Miss Ashford will not require discarded scraps tonight. The young man went pale. Your Grace, I only... Take it back. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The footman swallowed hard before retreating quickly toward the manor with the cloak still clutched in trembling hands. Lillian stared after him in stunned silence. You should not have done that. Rowan looked down at her calmly. Why? Vivian will be furious. That is not a particularly compelling argument. Despite herself, something dangerously close to laughter flickered weakly in Lillian's chest. It disappeared almost immediately. Rowan noticed anyway. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Softer for half a second before hardening again beneath the storm. Get in the carriage, Miss Ashford. The words came low and final. Lillian's heartbeat stumbled slightly. I cannot. You can. People will talk. People already talk. He stepped closer then. Not enough to touch her. Enough for her to catch the faint scent of winter cedar and cold smoke beneath the snow. The difference, Rowan said quietly, is that tonight they will do it carefully. Lillian's breath caught. Across the courtyard, she noticed movement near the ballroom windows. Silhouettes gathering behind the glass. Guests watching, curious, waiting to see what happened next. Of course they were. Society loved spectacle almost as much as cruelty. Rowan followed her line of sight once before offering his gloved hand calmly. Miss Ashford. Nobody had extended a hand toward her all evening. Not when Vivian humiliated her. Not when guests looked away. Not when she walked bleeding into the snow alone. Something inside her shifted painfully at the simple gesture. Lillian stared at his hand for one long second. Then she placed her trembling fingers into his. Warmth closed around her instantly. Firm. Steady. Rowan helped her down the remaining steps without hurry. Snow crunched beneath polished black boots while the storm wrapped around them in cold silence. The carriage door opened before they reached it. A driver in dark formal livery stepped down quickly, avoiding direct eye contact with the Duke. Blackthorn Manor, Your Grace? Rowan looked toward Lillian instead. Do you have somewhere else to go? The question settled heavily between them because both already knew the answer. Lillian felt humiliation rise sharp and bitter in her throat again. Not because he asked. Because she had nothing left to say. Rowan waited patiently while snow gathered in pale strands through her golden hair. Finally she lowered her eyes. No, something unreadable darkened his expression briefly. Then you are coming with me. Inside the ballroom, someone pulled the velvet curtains aside fully. Several guests now watched openly through the tall windows as the Duke of Blackthorn escorted Lillian Ashford toward his carriage beneath the storm. Shock traveled visibly across faces pressed behind candlelight and crystal. Rowan noticed them. This time he smiled slightly, coldly, possessively. Then he placed one gloved hand against the small of Lillian's back and guided her toward the carriage door. The entire courtyard seemed to hold its breath. Lillian paused just before stepping inside. Your Grace. Yes. She looked up at him carefully. Why are you helping me? Snow drifted across the space between them in soft white spirals. Rowan's gray eyes held hers for one long silent moment before he answered. Because I saw everything. The carriage door closed with a heavy sound that seemed to separate Lillian from the rest of the world in a single breath. Warmth surrounded her almost immediately. Not comfort. The kind of deep insulated warmth that belonged to old money and powerful men who never needed to consider whether winter might reach them. Thick black leather seats lined the interior. Dark walnut trim gleamed softly beneath the lantern fixed near the ceiling. A silver decanter rested untouched beside crystal glasses secured neatly against the carriage wall. Everything smelled faintly of cedar smoke and expensive wool. Lillian sat stiffly near the opposite window, careful not to let her damp skirts touch more than necessary. Snow clung to the hem of her silver gown in melting patches. Blood from her split lip had dried against her skin. Across from her, Duke Rowan Blackthorn removed his gloves slowly and set them beside his cane without speaking. The carriage lurched forward moments later. Through the frosted windows, Ashford Manor began disappearing behind thick curtains of falling snow. Lillian watched it vanish in silence. 23 years of her life reduced to fading lantern lights behind a storm. Strange how quickly a home could stop belonging to you. Rowan watched her carefully. You are shivering. I am all right. No, his tone remained calm. You are not. Lillian looked down at her hands instead of answering. They trembled visibly now. Cold, exhaustion, humiliation. She could not tell which had finally won. Rowan reached toward the silver compartment beside him and removed a folded wool blanket. Dark gray, heavy. He held it out once. Take it. Lillian hesitated automatically. Your Grace, I cannot. You can. His eyes remained steady on hers. And you will. Something inside his voice made refusal feel impossible without becoming childish. Lillian accepted the blanket quietly. Heat wrapped around her shoulders instantly when she pulled it close. The fabric smelled faintly of cedar and winter smoke again. His scent. The realization unsettled her enough that she focused quickly on the passing darkness outside instead. The carriage wheels rolled steadily through deep snow while distant estate lights disappeared behind them mile by mile. Neither spoke for several minutes. Silence inside the carriage felt different from silence inside Ashford Manor. There, silence had always felt sharp, dangerous, a punishment waiting to happen. Here it felt controlled, intentional, like Rowan simply did not waste words unnecessarily. Lillian became painfully aware of every small sound. The creak of leather, the storm outside, her own breathing, the quiet tap of Rowan's thumb once against the silver wolf head carved into his cane. Finally she forced herself to speak. "Thank you." Rowan's gaze lifted toward her slowly. "For what?" "For intervening tonight." That was not intervention. The answer confused her. Then what was it? Observation. Lillian frowned slightly. Rowan looked toward the dark window beside him. "I arrived at Ashford Manor 40 minutes before the ball began." Snow reflected faint silver across his profile while the carriage lantern flickered softly overhead. "I remained outside because I had no interest in attending another room full of people pretending they are decent while behaving otherwise." Lillian almost smiled despite herself. Almost. Rowan continued before she could answer. "Then your stepmother struck you in front of 200 guests." His jaw tightened slightly, barely noticeable. "And nobody moved." The memory burned fresh all over again. Lillian lowered her eyes. "Society does not enjoy uncomfortable scenes." No, Rowan's voice turned colder. "Society enjoys them very much. It simply prefers someone else to stop them." Silence settled again. Lillian stared down at the dark wool blanket gathered in her lap. "You should not have involved yourself." "Why?" "Vivian will not forgive public humiliation easily." Rowan looked almost bored by the idea. "I was not aware forgiveness from Mrs. Ashford held meaningful market value." The corner of Lillian's mouth twitched before she could stop it. Rowan noticed immediately. Something softened very briefly in his expression again. There and gone before she fully trusted it existed. "There," he said quietly. "You are capable of smiling." Heat touched her cheeks unexpectedly. "I was not aware I required proof. Most people who survive cruelty forget." The carriage rolled over uneven stone. Lillian steadied herself against the seat instinctively. Rowan's hand moved slightly as though prepared to catch her before stopping midway. He lowered it again without comment. Strange man, careful man, dangerous man. Lillian studied him quietly for the first time since entering the carriage. Up close, Rowan Blackthorne looked less polished than most aristocrats she had known. His black coat carried faint traces of melted snow across the shoulders. A thin scar cut through one dark eyebrow. His hands resting against the cane were rougher than expected for someone who controlled railroads and political contracts worth millions of dollars. Nothing about him felt decorative. Everything felt functional, like a weapon designed carefully enough to pass as a gentleman. "Why were you really at Ashford Manor?" she asked softly. Rowan's eyes met hers again. "Business." "You already said that." "Because it remains true." "That cannot possibly be the entire answer." One brow lifted slightly. "You are questioning me now?" "I am trying to understand why one of the most powerful men in New York escorted a disgraced woman into his carriage tonight." Rowan leaned back slightly against the leather seat. "And have you reached a conclusion?" "No, good." The answer frustrated her more than it should have. Lillian looked back toward the window sharply. Snow continued hammering against the glass in thick white waves. "You enjoy speaking in riddles." No, Rowan's voice remained calm. "I enjoy watching intelligent people notice things." "And what exactly am I meant to notice?" He studied her quietly, too quietly. "That your stepmother was frightened before I ever approached you tonight." Lillian blinked. "Frightened?" "Yes." Rowan's thumb tapped once against the silver wolf head again. "She recognized me immediately when I entered the ballroom. So did several others." He paused. "You did not." Heat crawled slowly into Lillian's face. "I was occupied. Bleeding generally does distract people." Despite herself, a soft laugh escaped her before she could stop it. Small, breathless. Real. Rowan went still. Completely still. Like the sound surprised him. Lillian noticed immediately and looked away quickly. Forgive me. Do not. His voice lowered slightly. It is rare enough to hear something honest in this city. The carriage continued north through deep winter roads while silence wrapped around them again. This silence felt different now too. Less sharp around the edges. Lillian hated how quickly her body had begun relaxing in his presence. Dangerous mistake. Men with power rarely gave without expecting something in return. She knew that better than anyone. "Where are you taking me?" she asked carefully. "Blackthorn Manor." "For how long?" Rowan looked toward the storm outside once before answering. "Until you decide otherwise." Her heartbeat stumbled slightly at the simplicity of it. No demands. No conditions. Somehow that unsettled her more than threats would have. "You barely know me." "That is incorrect." Lillian frowned. Rowan's gray eyes settled on her face steadily enough to make her pulse quicken again. "I know your stepmother controls every conversation in your house. I know your father stopped defending you years ago. I know half the people in that ballroom tonight pitied you while enjoying the spectacle anyway." His voice remained calm, controlled. "And I know you thanked a servant this evening after he opened a door for you even while your lip was bleeding." Lillian stared at him speechlessly. Rowan tilted his head slightly. "Most people reveal themselves clearly when they believe nobody important is paying attention." Cold spread slowly through her chest that had nothing to do with winter anymore. "You were watching me before tonight." Rowan did not answer immediately. The silence itself became answer enough. Lillian's pulse quickened. "How long?" "Long enough." "That is not an answer." "No," his eyes held hers steadily. "It is not." The carriage slowed suddenly beneath the storm. Outside, iron gates taller than two men emerged through heavy snowfall. Black stone pillars stood on either side crowned with silver wolf crests nearly hidden beneath ice. Beyond them stretched a long winding road disappearing into darkness and towering pine forests. Blackthorn territory. Rowan glanced toward the gates once before returning his attention to her. "There is one thing you should understand before we arrive." Lillian's fingers tightened unconsciously around the wool blanket. "What?" His expression hardened slightly beneath the carriage lantern. "Everyone at Blackthorn Manor fears me." The gates opened slowly ahead of them with a deep metallic groan. Snow swept across endless dark grounds beyond. Lillian looked back toward Rowan carefully. "Should I?" For the first time all evening, something almost dangerous flickered behind his gray eyes. "That," he said quietly, "depends entirely on whether you intend to lie to me." The gates closed behind the carriage with a deep iron groan that echoed through the storm like the sound of something ancient sealing shut. Lillian felt it in her chest more than she heard it. Outside the windows, endless pine forests stretched across frozen land beneath heavy snowfall, while the long private road curved deeper into darkness. No neighboring estates, no distant town lights, nothing except winter and the territory belonging to Rowan Blackthorn. The carriage rolled forward steadily through snow nearly 6 inches deep. Lillian sat wrapped in the heavy wool blanket while unease curled tighter inside her with every passing mile. She should have been terrified. Rationally, she knew that. A disgraced woman alone in the carriage of a powerful duke with a reputation sharp enough to frighten politicians and businessmen alike. Yet fear was not the emotion settling over her now. Exhaustion was. Bone-deep exhaustion. The kind that arrived after years of surviving humiliation quietly. Rowan remained across from her in complete silence. His gaze rested occasionally on the passing woods outside before returning to her with unsettling precision. Like he noticed every shift in her breathing, every tightening of her hands beneath the blanket. Every moment she looked toward the door as though considering escape despite the storm. Finally distant lights appeared ahead through falling snow. Warm golden lanterns glowing against darkness. Blackthorn Manor emerged slowly from the storm itself. Lillian had expected grandeur. Men like Rowan Blackthorn always owned homes built to impress. She had not expected this. The estate rose from the frozen cliffs like something carved directly from winter stone. Massive. Severe. Endless black windows reflecting snow and lantern light across towering walls of dark granite. Iron balconies curved around upper floors beneath sharp Gothic arches. Two enormous wings stretched outward from the central structure like folded shadows. Smoke rose from dozens of chimneys into the storm above. The manor did not look welcoming. It looked powerful, like a fortress pretending to be a home. "Good God!" Lillian whispered before she could stop herself. Rowan glanced toward the window beside her. That is generally the first reaction. The carriage passed beneath a massive stone archway and entered the front courtyard. Servants already waited outside despite the snow. 6 of them at least. Footmen in dark formal livery. Stable hands. A silver-haired butler standing perfectly straight beneath the falling storm with his hands clasped behind his back. Every single person straightened further the moment the carriage stopped. Fear. Rowan had not exaggerated. Lillian saw it immediately now. Not panic. Not dislike. Fear shaped carefully into obedience. The carriage door opened before Rowan moved. Freezing air rushed inside again. "Your Grace," the older butler said calmly. His voice carried the careful restraint of a man who understood mistakes around Rowan Blackthorn rarely happened twice. Rowan stepped out first. Snow struck his dark coat instantly while servants lowered their eyes respectfully. He turned back toward the carriage without acknowledging anyone else. "Miss Ashford." Lillian hesitated only briefly before placing her hand into his again. Warmth closed around her fingers immediately. Strong. Steady. The storm whipped violently across the courtyard as she stepped down beside him. Several servants looked up in visible surprise when they saw her. A woman. Young. Beautiful despite the blood still faintly visible at the corner of her mouth and the silver gown ruined by snow. Questions flickered silently across every face before disappearing just as quickly beneath discipline. Rowan noticed all of it. Of course he did. "Mr. Holloway," he said calmly to the butler beside the steps. "Prepare the East guest suite." The older man blinked once. Very slight. Almost invisible. "The East suite, Your Grace?" Rowan removed his gloves slowly while snow gathered across his shoulders. "Did I speak unclearly?" "No, Your Grace." Mr. Holloway lowered his head immediately. At once. Lillian felt confusion twist through her exhaustion. Even she understood enough about aristocratic households to recognize the significance. The East guest suite was not where disgraced strangers stayed. It was where royalty and political families stayed. Important guests. Protected guests. Rowan began walking toward the massive front doors without another explanation. Lillian hurried after him instinctively while servants scrambled to open the entrance before he reached it. Warmth flooded over them immediately the moment they stepped inside. Lillian stopped walking entirely. Blackthorn Manor was breathtaking. Not delicate like Ashford Manor with its pale marble and gold ornamentation designed to impress wealthy guests. This place felt darker. Older. Stronger. Black stone columns rose toward vaulted ceilings nearly 3 stories high. Massive chandeliers of black iron and crystal burned with hundreds of candle flames overhead. Deep burgundy carpets stretched across polished floors while towering windows framed endless snow outside. Oil portraits lined the walls. Generations of stern Blackthorn men painted in dark military coats and winter colors. The entire manor smelled faintly of cedarwood and smoke. Somewhere deeper inside, a clock chimed slowly through the silence. Lillian suddenly became painfully aware of how small she looked standing there in a torn silver gown with snow melting around her feet. Rowan removed his coat and handed it to a waiting servant without looking away from her. "You are staring. Your home is enormous." That is not necessarily a compliment. She looked toward the massive staircase curving upward beneath candlelight. "It feels..." Rowan waited. Lillian searched for the correct word carefully. "Lonely." Silence followed. Heavy enough that she immediately regretted speaking. Then Rowan looked away first. "Yes," he said quietly. "It does." The answer unsettled her more than if he had laughed. Mr. Holloway approached again moments later. "The East Suite is being prepared now, Your Grace. Dr. Whitmore has also been summoned as requested." Lillian looked up sharply. "A doctor is not necessary." Rowan did not even glance at her. "It is. Your Grace, truly, I am fine." His eyes lowered slowly toward the blood still visible along her lip. You are injured. It is only a cut. And hypothermia begins quietly. The calm certainty in his voice left little room for argument. Rowan turned toward the butler again. Tea. Food. Hot water for a bath. Mr. Holloway nodded immediately. Yes, Your Grace. Then his gaze flickered toward Lillian for half a second before lowering again. Respectful. Careful. Curious. Everyone in the manor seemed confused by her presence. More importantly, they seemed terrified to ask questions about it. Footsteps echoed suddenly from the upper balcony overlooking the entrance hall. Lillian looked up instinctively. A younger man leaned casually against the railing above. Tall. Dark blonde hair slightly too long. Sharp blue eyes carrying obvious amusement beneath the candlelight. He could not have been older than 30. Well, he drawled softly. This is new. Rowan's expression hardened instantly. Go back upstairs, Oliver. The younger man ignored the warning completely. His attention settled openly on Lillian instead. You brought home a woman bleeding in the middle of a blizzard. One brow lifted slightly. Should I alert the newspapers now or wait until morning? Oliver. The single word landed colder this time. Oliver Blackthorne descended the staircase anyway. Unlike Rowan, his presence felt easier. Dangerous in a different way. Less controlled. More charming. He stopped several feet away and offered Lillian an easy smile. Oliver Blackthorne. Unfortunate relative. Occasional disappointment. Lillian almost smiled automatically before catching herself. Lillian Ashford. Ashford. Understanding flickered briefly across his face. Ah! His gaze shifted toward Rowan slowly. That explains the expression. Rowan's eyes narrowed slightly. You are testing my patience. I was not aware you possessed any. Oliver ignored him again before turning back toward Lillian. You should know something important about this house. Oliver, Rowan warned quietly. Everyone here is terrified of him. Oliver nodded toward the Duke beside her. For excellent reasons, honestly. Lillian looked between them uncertainly. Strange warmth threaded unexpectedly through the exchange. Real conversation. Teasing. Human behavior untouched by calculated cruelty. It felt foreign after years inside Ashford Manor. Rowan removed his cufflinks slowly without looking at Oliver. You have exactly 5 seconds left. Understood. Oliver lifted both hands dramatically before stepping backward toward the stairs. Welcome to Blackthorne Manor, Miss Ashford. Surviving it tends to become interesting. Then he disappeared upstairs before Rowan could respond further. Silence settled briefly again. Lillian glanced toward Rowan carefully. Your cousin seems unafraid of you. That makes one of us. Despite herself, a soft laugh escaped her again. Small, exhausted, genuine. Several nearby servants froze immediately as though shocked by the sound. Rowan noticed that too. His gaze lingered on her face 1 second longer than necessary before turning away. Mr. Holloway. The butler stepped forward instantly. Your Grace. Rowan's voice remained calm, controlled, final. Miss Ashford's room will be beside mine. Silence crashed through the entrance hall so completely that even the crackling fireplace near the staircase suddenly sounded loud. Lillian stared at him in shock. Mr. Holloway went perfectly still. A nearby maid nearly dropped the folded towels in her hands. Nobody spoke. Nobody breathed. Rowan looked toward the butler slowly. Is there a problem? No, Your Grace. Mr. Holloway answered immediately. But the fear inside his voice deepened visibly now. Rowan turned back toward Lillian without another explanation. You are safe here, he said quietly. Then his gray eyes darkened slightly beneath the candlelight. And everyone in this house is going to understand that very clearly. Lillian did not sleep that night. She tried. God knew she tried. The East Guest Suite alone was larger than the entire 3rd floor of Ashford Manor. Dark mahogany furniture gleamed beneath soft candlelight. Heavy burgundy curtains framed towering windows overlooking endless snow-covered forests. A marble fireplace crackled quietly near the sitting area while steam still lingered faintly in the air from the bath servants had prepared for her an hour earlier. Everything felt warm, luxurious, safe, which was precisely why she could not relax inside it. Women like her did not simply wake up inside the private guest wing of powerful dukes. Not without consequences attached somewhere beneath the kindness. Lillian sat near the fireplace wrapped in a cream wool robe borrowed from the manor staff while untouched tea cooled slowly on the table beside her. Her silver gown had already been removed for cleaning. The sight of it disappearing into servant hands earlier unsettled her strangely, like watching the last remains of her old life vanish piece by piece. A soft knock interrupted the silence. Before she could answer, the door opened carefully and an older woman stepped inside carrying folded linens. Gray hair pinned neatly back. Dark uniform pressed perfectly. Sharp, intelligent eyes that immediately softened when they settled on Lillian. "I apologize for disturbing you, miss," the woman said gently. "Mr. Holloway asked me to bring these." Lillian stood automatically. "Thank you." The woman placed the linens carefully near the wardrobe before glancing toward the untouched tea tray beside the fire. "You have not eaten." Lillian looked away. "I was not hungry." The woman studied her quietly for one long second. That usually means someone is sad rather than full. The simple honesty nearly caught Lillian off guard. "I did not realize Blackthorn servants were philosophers." A faint smile touched the woman's mouth. "Only the old ones." She approached the fireplace slowly. "My name is Mrs. Green. I manage the upstairs staff." Lillian nodded politely. "Lillian Ashford." "Yes," Mrs. Green said softly. "We know." Something about the answer made Lillian uneasy immediately. "You know?" Mrs. Green adjusted one of the logs in the fireplace carefully before answering. "Your arrival has become the only thing this manor will discuss for the next month." "Wonderful." To her surprise, Mrs. Green laughed quietly. "You do not understand yet." Lillian frowned slightly. "Understand what?" The older woman hesitated. "His Grace does not bring people here. Surely he entertains guests. Politicians, businessmen, foreign investors." Mrs. Green shook her head slowly. "Never women." Unease tightened slowly in Lillian's chest again. "I see." "No," Mrs. Green corrected gently. "You really do not." The older woman glanced toward the connecting door near the far side of the suite. Large black wood trimmed in silver. Locked now. Lillian had assumed it led toward another guest room until this moment. Mrs. Green followed her gaze carefully. "That door connects directly to His Grace's private chambers." Lillian felt her stomach drop slightly. "Excuse me?" The East Suite was originally built for the Duchess wing many years ago. Mrs. Green's voice lowered instinctively despite the empty hallways outside. "Nobody has stayed here since his parents died." Silence settled heavily across the room. Lillian stared toward the connecting door again with entirely new awareness now. Rowan had placed her beside his own private rooms intentionally. Not for convenience, for protection. The realization felt strangely intimate, dangerous in ways she could not yet define. "I should not be here," Lillian said quietly. Mrs. Green's eyes softened further. "Perhaps not." "Then why did he bring me?" The older woman considered carefully before answering. "Because His Grace rarely does anything without a reason." That was somehow the least comforting thing she could have said. Another soft knock interrupted them both. Mrs. Green immediately straightened. "Enter." Mr. Holloway stepped inside with the same rigid precision he carried everywhere else in the manor. "Miss Ashford," he said respectfully. "Dr. Whitmore has arrived." Lillian opened her mouth immediately. "That is truly unnecessary." "His Grace disagrees," Mr. Holloway replied calmly. Of course he did. 20 minutes later, Lillian sat stiffly near the fireplace while Dr. Eleanor Whitmore examined the healing cut along her lip beneath warm candlelight. Unlike most society physicians, Eleanor Whitmore looked practical rather than ornamental. Early 40s perhaps. Dark brown hair pinned carelessly. Intelligent gray eyes sharp enough to notice things people preferred hidden. "You are fortunate," Eleanor said calmly while cleaning the small wound. "Another inch and your tooth would have split." Lillian winced slightly. "That would have improved my prospects considerably." Eleanor glanced up sharply before surprising laughter escaped her. You have a sense of humor after all. Occasionally. Good. Eleanor sat back slightly. It tends to help when living among blackthorns. Lillian glanced toward the closed suite doors instinctively. Everyone keeps saying that as though I should be afraid. Eleanor cleaned her hands carefully. You should be cautious. That is not the same thing. No, the physician's expression shifted subtly. It is not. Before Lillian could press further, the suite doors opened again without warning. Rowan entered still dressed entirely in black. Fresh snow lingered across the shoulders of his coat. He had not slept either. Lillian realized that instantly. Something colder than exhaustion shadowed his expression now. Doctor. Eleanor looked mildly unimpressed by his arrival. Your guest is alive. Rowan's gaze settled immediately on Lillian's face instead. Not the room. Not the physician. Her. And minor injuries. Exhaustion. Cold exposure. Eleanor crossed her arms lightly. Nothing life-threatening unless she continues refusing food. Rowan's eyes shifted toward the untouched tray beside the fireplace. Lillian resisted the sudden childish urge to defend herself. I simply was not hungry. You have not eaten since breakfast, Rowan said calmly. Lillian blinked. How would you know that? Silence followed. Rowan removed his gloves slowly before answering. Because you barely touched your plate at the ball. Heat crawled unexpectedly into her face again. He noticed everything. Every detail. Every silence. Every trembling hand beneath candlelight. Eleanor watched the exchange carefully with entirely too much amusement. Interesting, she murmured. Rowan ignored her completely. Eat something. Your Grace. Lillian. The use of her first name stopped her instantly. His voice remained low, controlled. Yet hearing her name from him felt strangely intimate inside the quiet suite. Rowan seemed to realize it at the same moment she did because silence stretched heavily between them afterward. Eleanor broke it first. Well. She stood smoothly and gathered her medical bag. Since nobody appears to be dying, I will leave before this room becomes more uncomfortable than it already is. Eleanor. Rowan warned quietly. What? The physician smiled faintly. I am a doctor. Observing tension is technically part of my profession. Then she turned toward Lillian kindly. Rest tonight. And if His Grace begins behaving like an overprotective tyrant, simply ignore him. We all do. Rowan looked entirely unimpressed. You are enjoying this far too much. Absolutely. Eleanor disappeared from the suite moments later, leaving silence behind again. Mr. Holloway and Mrs. Green had vanished quietly at some point during the examination as well. Now only the fireplace crackled softly between Rowan and Lillian while snow drifted heavily beyond the tall windows. Lillian became suddenly aware they were alone for the first time since leaving Ashford Manor. Rowan walked toward the fireplace slowly. Sit. I am already sitting. His gaze lowered briefly toward the untouched tray again. Eat. You are remarkably stubborn. That is not a criticism generally leveled against starving women. Despite herself, irritation flickered through her exhaustion. I am not starving. Rowan's eyes moved over her carefully then. Too carefully. Your wrists are too thin. Lillian froze. The observation landed harder than any insult Vivian had thrown earlier that evening because it carried no cruelty. Only fact. Rowan continued quietly. You hesitate before accepting food. You apologize before taking up space in a room. His jaw tightened slightly. And you flinched tonight when your stepmother raised her hand before she ever touched you. Silence crashed through the suite. Lillian stared down at her hands instantly because suddenly breathing felt difficult. Rowan remained motionless near the fire. How long? He asked softly. She knew exactly what he meant. It was never as terrible as people imagine, Lillian whispered automatically. Rowan's expression hardened immediately. That was not an answer. The old instinct rose instantly inside her. Minimize. Deflect. Protect everyone except herself. Vivian simply has strong opinions. Rowan's voice turned dangerously quiet. Lillian. Something inside her cracked slightly at the sound of her name spoken that way. Not impatient, not cruel, furious on her behalf. Her throat tightened painfully. After my father remarried, she said slowly, things became quieter. Rowan said nothing. Lillian stared into the fire because looking directly at him suddenly felt impossible. At first it was small things. Tutors dismissed. Invitations disappearing. My mother's belongings removed from the house. Her fingers twisted together tightly beneath the wool blanket. Then meals became conditional. Rowan went completely still. Conditional. She nodded once. If Vivian believed I embarrassed the family, dinner trays stopped arriving. The fire crackled sharply between them. Sometimes for a day. She swallowed carefully. Sometimes longer. Rowan's face changed very slightly then. Not visibly enough for most people to notice. Lillian noticed anyway. Something cold moved beneath his calm expression. Something dangerous. And your father? He asked quietly. Lillian laughed softly before she could stop herself. Not amusement. Exhaustion. My father stopped looking directly at me years ago. Silence again. Heavy. Suffocating. Rowan stared into the fire beside her with terrifying stillness. Finally Lillian forced herself to stand. I am sorry. His eyes lifted immediately. For what? This conversation. Shame burned slowly beneath her skin now that the words existed outside her own head. You were kind enough to offer shelter. I should not burden you with family matters. Rowan looked at her for one long second as though she had spoken another language entirely. Then he stepped closer. Close enough that she could see faint silver threaded through the dark gray of his eyes beneath firelight. Listen to me carefully. His voice dropped lower. You are not a burden in this house. The words hit her with almost physical force because no one had ever said them before. Not once. Lillian looked away immediately before emotion could betray her completely. Rowan's gaze lingered on her face briefly before shifting toward the writing desk near the windows. Several small leather journals rested there now beside folded stationery. Lillian frowned slightly. What is that? Your belongings. She stared in confusion. I did not bring journals. No, Rowan's expression darkened faintly. But someone hid them inside the false bottom of your traveling trunk. Her heartbeat stopped. Slowly, Rowan picked up the top journal from the desk. Worn brown leather. Familiar. Lillian's breath caught instantly. Where did you get that? Rowan's eyes lifted toward hers carefully. You wrote letters to someone for years. Cold swept through her chest. Rowan held the journal gently in one hand. The question, he said quietly, is why every single one of them was hidden instead of mailed. The room went completely silent except for the fire. Lillian stared at the journal in Rowan's hand as though it might explode if either of them moved too quickly. Worn brown leather. Frayed corners. A faint water stain near the spine from 3 winters ago when she spilled tea while writing beside her bedroom window after midnight. She knew every inch of it, because it had once held the only honest thoughts she allowed herself to keep. You opened my trunk, she said quietly. Rowan did not look remotely apologetic. Your belongings were soaked from snow. That is not the same thing. No, his voice remained calm. It is not. Lillian crossed her arms instinctively beneath the wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Defensive. Cornered. Rowan noticed immediately. He noticed everything. The false bottom was poorly constructed, he said. I found the journals while making certain nothing inside had been damaged. Her pulse quickened painfully. You read them. Silence answered her before he finally said, One. Heat flooded her face so fast it almost hurt. Which one? Rowan looked down briefly at the leather cover in his hand. The blue ribbon marker was already open. Lillian felt physically ill. Oh God! She turned away instantly toward the fireplace because she could not survive watching his expression while remembering what was written inside that particular journal. Not that one. Anything except that one. Rowan's voice lowered slightly behind her. You wrote 73 letters to people who never answered. Shame spread slowly through her chest. You should not have read them. No, his tone sharpened faintly. I should not have discovered that every single one remained hidden in your luggage instead of mailed. Lillian closed her eyes. The fire crackled softly between them. Outside the tall windows, snow continued falling endlessly across Blackthorn Manor. They were stupid, she whispered finally. No, Rowan stepped closer. They were desperate. Her throat tightened instantly. She hated that word. Desperate sounded weak. Pathetic. Like a woman standing outside locked doors begging to be chosen. You do not understand. Then explain it to me. Lillian laughed softly without humor. Why? Rowan's gray eyes remained fixed on her. Because someone spent years silencing you. The words landed harder than they should have. Lillian turned slowly toward him again. Rowan still held the journal carefully in one hand. Not mockingly. Not dismissively. Carefully. As though the contents mattered because she mattered. The realization unsettled her deeply. They were letters to my aunt, she admitted quietly. My mother's sister. Rowan waited. After my father remarried Vivian, Aunt Margaret moved to Boston. Lillian's fingers tightened around the blanket. She wrote to me often at first. Birthdays, Christmas, small things. A pause. Then the letters stopped arriving. Rowan's expression darkened slightly. How old were you? 15. And you believed she abandoned you. Lillian swallowed carefully. Vivian said Aunt Margaret grew tired of my self-pity. Rowan went very still. Did you believe that? At the time, a soft hollow laugh escaped her. I believed everything Vivian told me because she controlled every room inside that house. Silence stretched again. Rowan opened the journal slowly. Lillian's pulse jumped immediately. Please. His eyes lifted toward her face. I am not reading it aloud. Embarrassment burned through her anyway. Those pages contained the worst parts of her. Loneliness written carefully beneath candlelight while the rest of Ashford Manor slept. Rowan turned one page slowly. You wrote to your aunt every month for 8 years. I stopped eventually. No, his gaze lowered briefly toward the inked pages. You stopped hoping eventually. The truth of it hit hard enough that Lillian looked away again immediately. Rowan closed the journal gently. You never mailed these because your stepmother intercepted them. It was not a question. Lillian nodded once. The first time I attempted to send one through the post directly, Vivian discovered it. Her voice sounded distant now, numb around the edges. Afterward, she informed me that embarrassing the family publicly would have consequences. Rowan's jaw tightened slightly. What consequences? Isolation mostly. She stared into the fire. Servants dismissed if they spoke to me too kindly. Locked rooms. Missed meals. A pause. Silence. Rowan said nothing for several seconds. The quiet around him changed subtly though. Colder now. More dangerous. Lillian recognized the shift instinctively despite barely knowing him. You are angry, she whispered. His eyes lifted toward hers slowly. Yes. The honesty startled her. Most aristocratic men disguised emotion carefully beneath politeness and charm. Rowan did not bother pretending. You barely know me. That does not make this acceptable. The simple certainty in his voice unsettled something deep inside her. People survive worse. That sentence, Rowan said quietly, has excused cruelty for centuries. Lillian had no answer for that. Somewhere downstairs, a grandfather clock chimed midnight through the vast manor halls. Rowan finally set the journal carefully back onto the writing desk beside the others. There were at least 7 total. Years of hidden words stacked quietly beneath candlelight. How many people knew? He asked without turning around. About the letters? About what was happening inside Ashford Manor. Lillian hesitated. Servants knew parts of it. Your father knew all of it. Not a question again. She looked toward the fire instead of answering directly. Cowardice is a strange thing, she said softly. It rarely looks cruel from the inside. Mostly it looks tired. Rowan turned slowly back toward her. You are still protecting him. No, her voice cracked unexpectedly. I am trying not to hate him. Silence settled heavily between them. Rowan studied her face with unbearable focus. Like he could see every carefully hidden fracture she spent years covering with politeness and silence. What happened to your mother? he asked quietly. Lillian froze. Nobody asked about her mother anymore. Not after Vivian removed every portrait from Ashford Manor except one hidden upstairs in the old music room. She died when I was 12. Rowan waited. Pneumonia. Her throat tightened slightly. She was sick for weeks before anyone realized how serious it had become. She looked down at her hands. Afterward the house felt colder. Rowan's voice softened almost imperceptibly. And your father remarried quickly. 18 months later. Lillian smiled faintly without warmth. Vivian arrived with fresh flowers and opinions about redecorating. Something dangerously close to anger flickered behind Rowan's eyes again. How old was Clara? 14. Rowan frowned slightly. Then Vivian was already preparing her daughter for society while isolating you. Lillian blinked in surprise. You noticed that? I notice patterns. His gaze lowered briefly toward the journals. Your stepmother systematically removed every source of affection or independence available to you. Cold spread slowly through Lillian's chest because hearing it spoken aloud made the truth uglier somehow. More deliberate. Less survivable. You make it sound calculated. Rowan looked directly at her. It was. Silence again. Heavy. Unavoidable. Finally Lillian moved toward the writing desk slowly. Her fingers brushed lightly over the worn journals stacked there. Years of words nobody had ever read. Years of begging quietly into empty pages because paper felt safer than people. Rowan watched her carefully from across the room. There is one thing I still do not understand, he said quietly. What? His eyes darkened slightly beneath the firelight. Why your stepmother became frightened the moment she saw me tonight. Lillian frowned faintly. Because you are Duke Blackthorn. No, Rowan's voice remained calm. Fear like that does not come from reputation alone. Unease curled slowly through her stomach. What are you saying? Rowan walked toward the fireplace again slowly. I am saying your stepmother recognized something tonight. What? His jaw tightened slightly. Me. Lillian stared at him in confusion. Rowan looked toward the storm outside the windows. 3 months ago I began quietly investigating several financial irregularities tied to Ashford Holdings. Her heartbeat quickened instantly. Ashford Holdings? Your father's company. Rowan's eyes returned to hers carefully. Or rather what remains of it. Cold spread sharply through her chest now. You were investigating my family before tonight. Yes. Why? Rowan's expression hardened slightly. Because someone has been moving large amounts of money through shell accounts attached to your father's estate. Silence crashed through the suite. Lillian shook her head slowly. That is impossible. No, Rowan's voice turned colder. What is impossible is the fact that your father's company remained financially stable after losing nearly 60% of its holdings over the last decade. Her pulse began hammering now. I do not understand. Rowan reached inside his coat slowly and removed a folded document. Official. Thick cream paper stamped with financial seals. He handed it toward her carefully. Lillian unfolded it with trembling fingers. Numbers. Property transfers. Bank records she barely understood. Then one line near the bottom froze her completely. Ashford Estate Trust Beneficiary. Lillian Elizabeth Ashford. Her breath caught sharply. What is this? Rowan's gray eyes never left her face. That, he said quietly, is the reason your stepmother spent 8 years making certain you believed you owned nothing. Lillian read the document 3 times before the words stopped looking unreal. The fire crackled softly behind her while snow drifted endlessly across the dark windows of Blackthorn Manor. But all she could hear was the violent pounding of her own heartbeat. Beneficiary. Her name sat there in sharp black ink beneath legal seals and financial records she barely understood. Her fingers trembled against the paper. This cannot be real. Rowan stood near the fireplace watching her carefully. It is. No, she shook her head slowly. There must be some mistake. There is not. Lillian looked back down at the numbers again. Properties. Accounts. Investment holdings. Values large enough to make her stomach twist uneasily. My father told me years ago that the estate collapsed after my mother died. Rowan's expression darkened. Your father stopped controlling the estate the moment your grandfather's trust transferred ownership to you. Silence crashed through the suite. Lillian stared at him blankly. Transferred ownership? Rowan walked toward the writing desk slowly. Your grandfather rewrote his will 6 months before his death. He reached for another document among the files spread across the desk. The Ashford Trust was divided into 3 sections. Operational control remained temporarily with your father until you married or turned 25. He handed her another page carefully. But the actual ownership rights were placed entirely in your name. Lillian felt physically cold despite the warmth of the room. Vivian knew. Yes. My father knew. Rowan's jaw tightened. Yes. The betrayal hurt differently than the cruelty ever had. Cruelty at least admitted hatred openly. This was quieter. Years of carefully orchestrated helplessness. Years spent convincing her she had no value while hiding the fact that the estate itself legally belonged to her. Lillian sat down slowly near the fireplace because suddenly her knees no longer felt reliable. Rowan remained standing nearby, silent, watching her absorb the truth piece by piece. Why? She whispered finally. Why would they do this? Rowan's gaze lowered briefly toward the documents in her hands. Because control is easier when someone believes they deserve nothing. Her throat tightened painfully. Memories surfaced now with terrible clarity. Vivian monitoring every invitation, every friendship, every conversation involving finances or business. The endless reminders that she was dependent, useless, a burden living on borrowed generosity. None of it had been accidental. Oh God, Lillian whispered. Rowan crouched slightly beside her chair then, close enough that she could feel warmth radiating from him through the firelit silence. Look at me. She could not. Shame burned too deeply now. Shame and humiliation and the sick realization that she had spent years apologizing for taking up space inside a life that already belonged to her. Lillian. His voice lowered further. Steadier. Look at me. Slowly. She lifted her eyes. Rowan's expression remained calm, controlled, but anger simmered visibly beneath it now. Not directed at her. Never at her. You were manipulated, he said quietly. Not stupid. The words hit something fragile inside her chest hard enough that tears blurred her vision instantly. Lillian looked away again before they could fall. I should have noticed. How? Rowan asked sharply. You were isolated deliberately. I still should have known. Rowan stood abruptly then and crossed toward the windows with sudden restless energy. The movement startled her because until now he had remained almost unnaturally controlled. No, he said quietly. You should have been protected. Silence followed. Heavy. Dangerous. Rowan stared out across the snow-covered grounds beyond the glass while one hand flexed once at his side like he was forcing himself not to break something. Lillian noticed that too. You are angry again. Yes. He did not deny it anymore. Rowan rarely denied anything. How long have you known? She asked carefully. About the trust? Rowan turned back toward her slowly. 3 weeks. And you said nothing? Because I needed proof before making accusations against your family publicly. He walked back toward the fire. Tonight confirmed more than I expected. Lillian frowned faintly. What do you mean? Rowan's eyes darkened slightly. Mrs. Ashford panicked the moment she realized I recognized you. Unease settled again in Lillian's chest. Recognized me? Rowan studied her face carefully. You still do not understand what you represent. Then explain it to me. He held her gaze steadily. The Ashford estate includes nearly 4,000 acres of northern rail territory. Lillian blinked. Rail territory? Land my competitors have spent years trying to acquire. Rowan's expression hardened further. If ownership transferred publicly to you, every financial arrangement your stepmother has been using illegally begins collapsing immediately. Cold spread slowly through her stomach. Illegal. Rowan nodded once. Someone has been forging signatures attached to your inheritance trust. The room seemed to tilt slightly. My father would never. She stopped speaking halfway through the sentence because suddenly she was no longer certain of anything. Rowan noticed the hesitation immediately. You already know he allowed it. Lillian closed her eyes briefly. The worst part was that he was right. Deep down, somewhere beneath years of excuses and carefully maintained denial, she already knew. Her father had looked away because looking away was easier than confronting Vivian. Easier than protecting his daughter. I kept trying to earn their love, she whispered softly. Rowan went completely still. Lillian stared into the fire while words she had buried for years rose quietly to the surface. Every time Vivian punished me, I thought if I behaved better she might stop. Her fingers tightened around the blanket in her lap. If I stayed quieter, smiled more, became less inconvenient. She laughed weakly through the ache building in her chest. I spent years trying to deserve basic kindness. Rowan's expression shifted slightly then. Something sharp and painful moving behind his eyes before disappearing beneath control again. You should never have needed to earn it. Tears burned again. Lillian hated tears. Vivian always called crying manipulative. Weak. I do not know what to do now. Rowan answered immediately. Nothing. She looked up sharply. Excuse me? You are exhausted. He moved toward the liquor cabinet beside the fireplace and poured water instead of whiskey. And overwhelmed. He handed the glass toward her carefully. For tonight, you rest. Lillian accepted the water slowly. Their fingers brushed briefly. Warmth moved unexpectedly through her chest before she looked away again too quickly. Rowan remained standing beside her chair. Too close. Close enough that she could hear the quiet rhythm of his breathing beneath the fire crackling nearby. And tomorrow? She asked softly. His gray eyes settled on her face with terrifying calm. Tomorrow I begin dismantling everything your stepmother built. The certainty in his voice sent chills down her spine. Not because she feared him, because she suddenly understood exactly why everyone else did. A soft knock interrupted the silence before either could speak again. Rowan stepped back immediately. The distance felt strangely noticeable now. Enter. Mr. Holloway appeared in the doorway looking unusually tense. Your Grace. Rowan's attention shifted instantly. What is it? The butler hesitated briefly before answering. There is a situation downstairs. Rowan's expression hardened. Explain. Mrs. Ashford has arrived. Silence crashed violently through the suite. Lillian went completely still. What? Mr. Holloway looked visibly uncomfortable now. Mrs. Ashford arrived 20 minutes ago with Miss Clara and 2 attorneys. Rowan's eyes darkened instantly. How did they get through the gates? Mrs. Ashford claimed she was here to retrieve stolen property. Lillian felt sick suddenly. Rowan's voice dropped dangerously low. And where are they now? In the west drawing room. Mr. Holloway swallowed carefully. Mrs. Ashford is demanding immediate access to Miss Ashford. Rowan looked toward Lillian slowly. The firelight reflected cold silver through his eyes now. Interesting, he said quietly. Lillian's pulse hammered painfully against her ribs. She came here herself. Rowan nodded once. Yes. His expression turned colder by the second. Which means she is far more frightened than I originally believed. He reached for his black coat draped across the nearby chair. Every movement suddenly precise, controlled, dangerous. Lillian stood immediately. I should speak with her. Rowan's gaze snapped toward her. No. She will cause a scene. She already has. Your Grace. Lillian. His voice cut through hers cleanly. Do you know what desperate people do when they begin losing control? She stared at him uncertainly. Rowan buttoned his coat slowly beneath the firelight. They make mistakes. The air inside the suite suddenly felt colder. He walked toward the door before pausing briefly beside her. Stay here. Lillian looked up at him quickly. And if I do not? Rowan's eyes held hers for one long second. Then I will be forced to lock this entire wing myself. Her breath caught slightly. Not a threat. Protection. Fierce enough to sound dangerous anyway. Rowan turned toward the doorway again. Mr. Holloway straightened instantly. Your Grace. Rowan's voice became pure ice. Nobody enters this floor without my permission. Then he looked back toward Lillian one final time. Including your stepmother. The moment Rowan left the suite, the entire floor seemed to change around Lillian. Not quieter, tighter, like the manor itself had straightened beneath the weight of his command. She stood motionless near the fireplace, listening to his footsteps disappear down the corridor outside while snow rattled softly against the windows beyond the dark forest. Stay here. The words still lingered in the room long after he vanished. Nobody enters this floor without my permission, including your stepmother. Lillian should have obeyed him. Rationally, she understood that. Vivian frightened people when cornered. Worse, she charmed them while doing it. But the idea of Rowan facing her stepmother alone unsettled Lillian in ways she could not explain. Because Rowan did not understand one dangerous truth about Vivian Ashford yet. Cruel people became unpredictable when terrified. A second knock interrupted her thoughts. Softer this time. Careful. Miss Ashford. Mrs. Green's voice drifted through the door. May I come in? Lillian straightened automatically. Yes. The older woman entered carrying a dark blue dress folded carefully across her arms. Rich velvet trimmed with silver embroidery. Elegant without appearing fragile. His Grace requested this for you, Mrs. Green said gently. Lillian stared at the gown in confusion. Requested. The west drawing room is still occupied. Mrs. Green hesitated briefly. And I suspect your Grace would prefer you dressed before things become unpleasant. Unease tightened slowly in Lillian's chest. How unpleasant? Mrs. Green looked toward the corridor instinctively before lowering her voice. Mr. Holloway says Mrs. Ashford arrived shouting. That sounded painfully accurate. Lillian accepted the dress slowly. The velvet felt impossibly soft beneath her fingers. Expensive. Beautiful. Entirely unlike anything Vivian ever allowed her to wear. I cannot wear this. Yes, Mrs. Green said calmly. You can. Strange how often people inside Blackthorn Manor answered her that way. Like refusal simply no longer held power here. Lillian glanced toward the closed suite doors again. What is happening downstairs? Mrs. Green sighed quietly. From what I understand, your stepmother demanded immediate access to you. And Rowan. The older woman's expression shifted subtly. His Grace informed her she was a guest in his house and should behave accordingly. Lillian almost winced. That did not go well. No, a faint flicker of satisfaction crossed Mrs. Green's face. Apparently it did not. 20 minutes later, Lillian descended the grand staircase of Blackthorn Manor, with one hand lightly resting against the polished banister, while her heartbeat pounded harder with every step. The dark blue velvet dress fit perfectly despite clearly never being tailored for her. The fabric brushed softly against her skin, while silver embroidery caught the candlelight overhead with every movement. Mrs. Green had pinned her hair back simply, elegantly. The bruising near her lip remained faintly visible despite the housemaid's attempts to conceal it. Somehow that felt important now. Do not hide what happened. The entrance hall below stood almost unnaturally silent. Servants moved carefully between corridors with lowered eyes and rigid posture. Everyone sensed tension spreading through the manor like smoke. Halfway down the staircase, Lillian heard Vivian's voice. Sharp, controlled, furious beneath the politeness. You cannot seriously expect me to believe my stepdaughter is here willingly. Lillian stopped moving instinctively. The west drawing room doors stood partially open across the entrance hall. Warm golden light spilled across dark marble floors while voices drifted outward clearly now. Rowan answered calmly. Your expectations are not my responsibility. Lillian's pulse quickened. Slowly, she moved closer. Inside the drawing room, Vivian Ashford sat rigidly on a dark leather sofa beneath towering candle sconces. Clara sat beside her wrapped in pale cream fur with obvious discomfort tightening her expression. Two attorneys remained near the fireplace clutching portfolios and legal documents while trying very hard not to look directly at Rowan Blackthorn. Rowan stood near the liquor cabinet dressed entirely in black again. One hand rested loosely against the silver head of his cane. Calm, motionless, terrifying. Vivian looked immaculate despite the storm outside. Dark emerald silk, diamonds at her throat, hair perfectly arranged. She had rebuilt her social mask already. Of course she had. Lillian is emotionally unstable, Vivian continued smoothly. She has always been dramatic after family disagreements. Rowan poured whiskey into a crystal glass without looking at her. Interesting. It is not uncommon for young women to overreact. No doubt. Which is why I came personally tonight. Vivian's smile sharpened slightly. To prevent gossip from spreading unnecessarily. Rowan finally looked at her then. Mrs. Ashford. His voice lowered just enough to freeze the entire room instantly. You struck your stepdaughter hard enough to split her lip in front of 200 witnesses. Silence crashed down across the drawing room. One attorney visibly swallowed. Clara looked toward the floor immediately. Vivian's expression tightened for half a second before smoothing again. Lillian has always been delicate. Rowan took one slow sip of whiskey. Careful. The single word landed colder than the winter outside. Vivian straightened slightly. Excuse me? You are mistaking my restraint for patience. Lillian felt chills spread slowly down her spine. She had never seen anyone speak to Vivian that way before. Not her father. Not society. Not anyone. Rowan looked almost bored while doing it, which somehow made the warning worse. Vivian's eyes narrowed faintly. With all respect, Your Grace, this is a private family matter. No, Rowan set the crystal glass aside carefully. The moment you arrived at my home after midnight demanding access to a woman you publicly humiliated, it became my matter. Lillian's breath caught softly. Something changed in Clara's expression then. Guilt, perhaps. Fear, maybe. The younger woman glanced uneasily toward her mother. Mother, Clara said quietly. Perhaps we should simply speak with Lillian privately. Vivian ignored her completely. My stepdaughter has been manipulated. Rowan's eyes darkened instantly. By whom? You. Silence. Heavy. Dangerous silence. Even the fire seemed quieter now. Vivian leaned forward slightly. You investigate powerful families for business advantage, Your Grace. Everyone knows this. Rowan did not move. Continue. Lillian is vulnerable. Emotional. Easily influenced. Vivian's voice softened carefully. I believe you exploited that tonight. Lillian saw the exact moment the attorneys realized Vivian had made a catastrophic mistake. Both men went visibly pale. Rowan became still in a way that felt almost unnatural. Like the room itself stopped breathing around him. You believe, he said quietly, that I manipulated Miss Ashford into leaving after you assaulted her publicly. Vivian hesitated. Only briefly. I believe appearances can be misleading. Rowan smiled then, coldly. The expression held absolutely no warmth inside it. Mr. Holloway. The butler appeared instantly from the hallway doorway as though he had been waiting. Your Grace. Bring the witness statements. Both attorneys stiffened immediately. Vivian's composure cracked slightly for the first time all evening. Witness statements? Rowan's gray eyes never left her face. 37 guests provided written accounts before leaving Ashford Manor tonight. Lillian stared in shock. Rowan had prepared this already. While she sat upstairs trying to understand her inheritance, he had been building a case against Vivian piece by piece. Mr. Holloway handed a thick folder toward the Duke calmly. Rowan removed several papers from inside before tossing them across the table in front of Vivian. Lady Pembroke. Another sheet followed. Senator Whitmore. Another. Judge Holloway. Vivian's face slowly lost color with every document sliding across the polished wood. Rowan's voice remained calm throughout. All witnessed you striking Miss Ashford. Clara looked physically ill now. Mother? Enough, Vivian snapped sharply. Rowan's eyes shifted toward Clara then. Not cruel. Assessing. Did you know? The younger woman froze. Vivian stood abruptly. My daughter will not answer questions in this absurd interrogation. Rowan remained seated. Sit down. 3 simple words. The entire room obeyed instinctively. Even Vivian stopped moving for half a second before realizing what she had done. Lillian felt the tension crackle sharply through the air now. Rowan did not raise his voice. He never needed to. Vivian's composure fractured further. You cannot keep her here. Rowan glanced toward the doorway calmly. Miss Ashford. Every head turned instantly. Lillian stood frozen in the entrance now with one hand still resting lightly against the doorframe. She had not intended to reveal herself, but Rowan had known she was there almost immediately. Of course he had. Silence spread violently through the room. Clara's eyes widened at the sight of her. Vivian stared openly. Not at Lillian herself. At the dark blue velvet. At the silver embroidery. At the unmistakable fact that Rowan Blackthorne had dressed her like someone important. "Lillian," Clara whispered softly. Vivian recovered first. She always did. "There you are." Her smile appeared instantly. False warmth painted carefully across sharp features. "Darling, you frightened everyone." Lillian almost laughed at the performance. Almost. Rowan stood slowly from his chair. "Come here." The words were quiet. Calm. Absolute. Every person in the room felt it immediately. Lillian moved before thinking better of it. The closer she came to Rowan, the steadier her breathing became. Strange. Dangerous. Comforting. Vivian watched the movement with growing alarm. "Lillian," she said carefully. "You belong with your family." Rowan's expression turned glacial. "She is standing with her family." The silence afterward felt deafening. Clara looked up sharply. One attorney nearly dropped his papers. Vivian's face finally cracked completely. Not anger this time. Fear. Real fear. Rowan stepped beside Lillian then. Close enough that warmth brushed softly against her arm beneath the candlelight. "Look at her," he said quietly to the room. Nobody moved. Rowan's voice lowered further. Deadlier somehow for its softness. "Look at her before any of you speak about what she deserves again." Slowly, every eye in the drawing room turned fully toward Lillian Ashford for the first time in years. Not invisible. Not discarded. Seen. And beside her, Rowan Blackthorne reached up calmly and removed his black winter coat before draping it carefully across her shoulders like a public declaration no one inside that room misunderstood. Nobody in the drawing room moved after Rowan placed his coat around Lillian's shoulders. The gesture itself should not have carried so much weight. A coat. Simple courtesy. Except nothing about Rowan Blackthorne was ever simple, and everyone in that room understood immediately what had just happened. Protection from a man like Rowan was never casual. It was territorial. Vivian understood that first. Lillian watched the realization spread slowly across her stepmother's face beneath the candlelight. Fear sharpened the edges of her composure now. Real fear. Not social embarrassment. Not wounded pride. Fear of losing control permanently. Clara looked between them uncertainly. The two attorneys remained frozen beside the fireplace like men suddenly regretting every career decision that led them into this room tonight. Rowan stood beside Lillian with one hand resting lightly against the silver wolf head of his cane. Calm. Silent. Untouchable. The entire drawing room seemed to revolve around him without his needing to raise his voice even once. Vivian recovered first. Of course she did. "Your Grace," she said carefully. "Surely you understand how inappropriate this appears." Rowan did not look at her immediately. His attention remained on Lillian instead. "Are you cold?" The question startled her slightly. No, a pause. "Not anymore." Something softened very briefly in his expression before disappearing again. Only then did he turn toward Vivian. "I do not concern myself with appearances." Vivian's smile tightened. "That is easy to say for a man whose reputation survives anything." Rowan's gaze sharpened faintly. "And yours does not." Silence again. Sharp enough to cut through the room. Vivian folded her hands together carefully in her lap. Lillian recognized the movement instantly. Calculating. Resetting. "Lillian," her stepmother said gently. "Come home." The words sounded almost tender. Anyone unfamiliar with Vivian Ashford might have believed them sincere. Lillian knew better than anyone how dangerous false softness could become. "Why?" she asked quietly before she could stop herself. Vivian blinked once, clearly not expecting resistance. "Because you are upset." No, Lillian's voice trembled slightly despite her efforts to steady it. "I asked why." The room went very still. Rowan said nothing, but Lillian felt his attention shift toward her immediately. Focused. Careful. Vivian's expression cooled by 1 degree. Because families belong together. Lillian almost laughed. Instead, she looked directly at her stepmother for perhaps the first time in years. You threw me into the snow tonight. Clara closed her eyes briefly. One attorney looked down at the floor entirely. Vivian's mask slipped for half a second. You embarrassed me publicly. So you punished me publicly. Lillian. Her stepmother's voice sharpened. Enough. Something inside Lillian cracked quietly then. Not weakness. The opposite. Years of silence breaking apart beneath the weight of finally being seen. No, she whispered. The single word echoed softly through the drawing room. Vivian stared at her in shock. Lillian stood straighter beneath Rowan's black coat. Warmth still surrounded her from the heavy wool and the faint scent of cedar smoke clinging to it. Strange how safety changed posture. You told me for years that I was worthless, Lillian said quietly. That nobody would ever choose me. That I should be grateful simply to remain inside your house. Vivian's eyes flashed dangerously. You are emotional. I am angry. Silence. Real silence this time. Clara looked like she might cry. Rowan remained completely motionless beside Lillian, but she sensed the tension in him instantly now, like a storm holding itself together through sheer discipline. Vivian stood slowly from the sofa. This is absurd. She looked toward Rowan sharply. You have filled her head with nonsense about inheritance and trusts and imaginary conspiracies. Rowan finally moved then. Only slightly, yet the entire room stiffened immediately. Imaginary. His voice lowered dangerously. Vivian hesitated. Your Grace. Mr. Holloway. The butler appeared instantly beside the doorway again. Rowan held out one hand calmly. A second folder was placed into it without delay. Thicker than the first. He opened it slowly while Vivian's face lost more color by the second. 3 forged signatures attached to the Ashford Estate Trust. Rowan placed one document onto the table. For illegal property transfers. Another followed. And approximately $6.4 million redirected through shell accounts over the last 7 years. The second attorney visibly paled. Clara stared openly at her mother now. Vivian's voice tightened sharply. You cannot prove any of that. Rowan looked almost insulted by the suggestion. Mrs. Ashford. He closed the folder carefully. I do not discuss accusations unless they are already proven. Cold spread visibly through the room. Lillian felt her pulse hammering again beneath the heavy silence. Vivian turned toward the attorneys desperately now. Say something. Neither man moved. Rowan's eyes shifted lazily toward them. Gentlemen. The older attorney swallowed hard. Mrs. Ashford, he said cautiously. Perhaps we should postpone further discussion until additional review can be conducted. Betrayal flickered across Vivian's face instantly. Not because they disagreed. Because they retreated. Predators understood when another predator held more power. Rowan Blackthorne held more power than anyone else in this room combined. Vivian saw it now too. Her gaze snapped back toward Lillian. Fury finally broke through the elegance entirely. Do you have any idea what you are doing? Lillian flinched automatically. Rowan noticed immediately. His expression changed at once. Dangerous. Careful. The single word landed like ice water across exposed skin. Vivian ignored him. You think this man rescued you? Her voice rose sharply now. Men like Rowan Blackthorne do not save women, Lillian. They collect them. The insult hung in the room for exactly 1 second before Rowan stepped forward. Calmly. Slowly. Somehow that made it infinitely worse. Leave. Vivian laughed bitterly. Or what? Rowan stopped directly in front of her. Tall enough that she finally appeared smaller beside him. Or I begin explaining exactly how many federal laws your family violated while stealing from Miss Ashford. His voice remained terrifyingly soft. And I do it publicly. The entire room froze. Clara looked horrified now. Mother, she whispered. Vivian's breathing quickened visibly. You would destroy us. Rowan's eyes never changed. No, a pause. You did that yourself. Lillian stared at him quietly. Nobody had ever defended her like this before. Not openly. Not without hesitation. Rowan stood between her and every cruel thing in the room, as though it was the most natural position in the world for him to occupy. The realization shook something deep inside her chest. Vivian noticed it too. Of course she did. Her expression shifted subtly as she looked between them, calculating again. I see. Rowan's jaw tightened faintly. Do you? Vivian smiled suddenly. Sharp. Ugly. You are attached already. Silence. Lillian felt heat rush into her face instantly. Rowan remained perfectly still, which somehow confirmed the accusation more than denial would have. Vivian laughed softly. How interesting. Mrs. Ashford, Rowan said quietly. You are dangerously close to exhausting my restraint. Then answer me honestly. Her eyes locked onto his. Would you still care this much if she were plain? Poor? Forgettable? Rowan did not blink. She was all three according to society. The room went completely silent again. Rowan's gaze shifted briefly toward Lillian beside him. Softer now. Quieter. And I still noticed her. Lillian forgot how to breathe for one impossible second. Vivian saw it happen. Fury twisted instantly across her face. You foolish girl. She turned sharply toward Lillian. Do you really believe this ends well for women like us? Women like you, Lillian whispered softly, are exactly why women like me stop surviving. Vivian stared at her in shock. Clara's hand flew toward her mouth. Rowan looked toward Lillian slowly. Something unreadable moved through his eyes then. Pride, perhaps. Maybe something more dangerous. The fire crackled softly between all of them while snow battered the manor windows outside. Finally Vivian straightened her shoulders with cold dignity. Very well. Her voice turned smooth again. Controlled. If Miss Ashford wishes to remain here, I cannot stop her. Rowan's eyes narrowed slightly. He recognized surrender when he heard it, and he did not trust it. However, Vivian continued carefully, the Winter Foundation Ball takes place in 4 nights. Unease curled slowly through Lillian's chest. Vivian smiled faintly. The entire city will attend. Rowan said nothing. Vivian's gaze settled fully on Lillian now. If you truly believe you belong beside Duke Blackthorn after one dramatic evening, then appear publicly beside him there. The challenge hung in the room like smoke. Let society decide what you are. Clara whispered softly, Mother, stop. But Vivian was watching only Rowan now, testing him, pushing deliberately toward the edge of his patience. Unless, Vivian added quietly, His Grace suddenly prefers hiding his guests after midnight instead of presenting them in daylight. Dangerous silence followed. Rowan's expression became unreadable, cold enough now that even the servants standing outside the room visibly stiffened. Then slowly Rowan turned toward Lillian. Do you wish to attend the ball? The question startled her because he genuinely meant it. Choice. Real choice. Her entire life people decided for her, spoke over her, controlled every room before she entered it. And now the most powerful man in New York stood beside her waiting for her answer instead of making it himself. Lillian looked toward Vivian slowly, then toward Clara, then finally back to Rowan. Yes, she whispered. Rowan nodded once. Final. Good. His gaze shifted toward Vivian again. Ice cold. Then Miss Ashford will attend the Winter Foundation Ball with me. The entire room froze. Even Vivian looked genuinely stunned now. Rowan stepped closer to Lillian then, not touching her, protecting her anyway. And every person in New York society, he said quietly, is going to understand exactly where she stands. Vivian Ashford left Blackthorn Manor 30 minutes later with her lawyer's pail beside her and Clara silent beneath the storm. Nobody attempted another argument on the way out. Nobody looked directly at Rowan Blackthorn as he stood in the entrance hall watching them leave with one hand resting against his cane and the other tucked calmly behind his back. The massive front doors closed behind them with heavy finality. Silence settled over the manor instantly afterward. Deep, thick, almost exhausted, Lillian remained standing near the staircase wrapped in Rowan's black coat, while snow swirled outside beyond the towering windows. Her heartbeat still had not returned to normal. Everything from the last several hours felt unreal somehow. The inheritance, the confrontation, Rowan publicly choosing her side without hesitation. None of it belonged to the life she understood. Mr. Holloway cleared his throat softly from nearby. "Will there be anything else tonight, Your Grace?" Rowan's gaze remained fixed on the closed front doors for one long second before answering. "No," the butler nodded immediately. "Very good, Your Grace." Servants disappeared quietly through adjoining corridors, while the manor lights dimmed one by one beneath midnight silence. Soon only Rowan and Lillian remained alone in the vast entrance hall beneath flickering chandeliers and shadows stretched long across marble floors. Lillian looked toward him carefully. "You did not need to do that." Rowan finally turned toward her. "Do what?" "Challenge her publicly." His expression remained unreadable. "Yes." A pause. "I did." She frowned slightly. "Why?" Rowan studied her face for several silent seconds. "Because she wanted you frightened again." The simplicity of the answer struck harder than anything dramatic might have. Lillian looked away toward the dark windows. "She usually succeeds." "Not tonight." Rowan's voice lowered slightly. "Did you notice?" Slowly, Lillian realized he was right. For the first time in years, Vivian had looked unsettled instead of untouchable, cornered instead of controlling the room. Lillian had spent so long surviving her stepmother's cruelty that she had forgotten fear could move in the opposite direction too. Rowan watched understanding settle across her expression carefully. "Good," he said quietly. "Remember that feeling." The fire from the nearby drawing room crackled softly through the open doorway beside them. Lillian became suddenly aware of how tired she truly was now that the confrontation had ended. Exhaustion pulled heavily at her shoulders beneath the warm black coat. Rowan noticed immediately. Of course he did. "You should sleep." "I do not think I can." Rowan glanced toward the staircase. "Come with me." Lillian blinked slightly. "Where?" "The library." 15 minutes later, Lillian sat near the fireplace inside the Blackthorn Library, wrapped in silence thick enough to feel sacred. The room stretched across nearly the entire western wing of the manor. Towering bookshelves climbed 2 stories high beneath iron balconies and dark carved ceilings. Hundreds of leather-bound volumes lined the walls beneath golden candlelight. Snow drifted softly beyond enormous arched windows overlooking frozen cliffs and endless forests below. It felt less like a room and more like a fortress built entirely from knowledge and loneliness. Rowan crossed toward a side cabinet near the fireplace while Lillian wandered slowly between shelves. "You read all of these?" "Most." She glanced back toward him in disbelief. "There must be thousands." "Approximately 12,000. "That is an alarming answer." Rowan poured tea instead of whiskey again. "You say that as though I counted personally. Did you?" A pause. "Yes." Despite everything, Lillian laughed softly beneath her breath. The sound echoed warmly through the quiet library. Rowan looked toward her immediately. Something in his expression eased almost imperceptibly at the sound. Lillian noticed that too now. He watched her carefully when she forgot to look sad. Strange man. Strange, dangerous man who treated her bruised silence like something precious instead of inconvenient. Rowan handed her a warm cup once she returned near the fireplace. Their fingers brushed again briefly. Warmth moved sharply through her chest before she stepped back too quickly. Rowan noticed. Again. "You keep retreating every time I touch you." Heat flooded her face instantly. "I do not." One dark brow lifted slightly. "You absolutely do." Lillian looked into her tea instead of answering. Rowan sat across from her in one of the deep leather chairs near the fire. Black clothing. Silver firelight. Sharp gray eyes following every expression she failed to hide quickly enough. "You are afraid of me," he said quietly. Lillian looked up immediately. No, Rowan waited calmly. She hesitated. "Not exactly." Interesting distinction. Silence settled briefly again. Finally Lillian set the teacup carefully onto the table beside her. "You are," she searched for the right word, "intense." Rowan looked entirely unsurprised by that. "Most people use harsher language. Most people are probably frightened of you. Are you?" Lillian held his gaze for one long second beneath the firelight. "I think," she admitted softly, "I am more frightened of wanting to trust you." The honesty escaped before she could stop it. Rowan went completely still. Firelight flickered across sharp features suddenly unreadable now. Neither spoke for several seconds afterward. The library seemed quieter somehow. Closer. Rowan finally looked toward the flames instead of her. That is probably wise. Something about the answer hurt unexpectedly. Lillian frowned slightly. You agree. I am not a safe man, Lillian. His voice remained calm, matter of fact. You should understand that before placing faith in me. She studied him quietly across the fire. Because you are powerful? Rowan's jaw tightened faintly. Because powerful men eventually become dangerous to anyone standing too close. The words felt older than tonight somehow. Older than her. Lillian looked down at the black coat still wrapped around her shoulders. You have not been dangerous to me. Rowan's eyes lifted slowly toward her face again. Not intentionally. Silence stretched once more. Heavy now. Charged in ways she did not entirely understand yet. A soft knock interrupted before either could speak again. Mr. Holloway entered carrying another stack of documents. Your Grace. Rowan's expression shifted instantly back toward cold focus. What is it? The Chicago records arrived. Unease curled slowly through Lillian's chest. Rowan accepted the file immediately. Thick, official. Several pages marked with red tabs and handwritten notes. That was fast. Your investigators were already waiting. Rowan opened the folder slowly while Mr. Holloway remained standing nearby. Lillian watched his expression sharpen line by line as he read. Something dangerous settled across his face again. What happened? She asked quietly. Rowan looked up slowly. Your grandfather hired a private attorney 3 months before he died. Lillian frowned. For the trust. Yes. Rowan removed one yellow document from the folder carefully. Because he believed someone inside the family intended to challenge your inheritance after his death. Cold spread through her stomach. He knew. He suspected. Rowan's gray eyes darkened beneath the firelight. Which means this did not begin with Vivian. Silence crashed heavily through the library. Lillian stared at him blankly. What are you saying? Rowan handed her the document carefully. Old legal correspondence. Dated nearly 11 years earlier. Her eyes scanned the page quickly until one name stopped her completely. Richard Ashford. Her father. Beneath it another sentence nearly stole the breath from her lungs entirely. Concern regarding pressure from Mr. Ashford to restructure beneficiary control prior to marriage transfer. Lillian's hands trembled violently now. No, Rowan watched her carefully. Lillian. No, her voice cracked sharply. My father would never try to steal from me before my mother even died. Rowan remained silent, which somehow made it worse. Lillian looked down again, desperately searching the document for another explanation. There was none. Only signatures, dates, legal warnings ignored for over a decade. Oh God! She stood abruptly and walked toward the nearest bookshelf because suddenly breathing felt impossible inside the room. Her father. Before Vivian. Before the isolation and cruelty and silence. Her father had already been trying to take control of the inheritance that legally belonged to her. The realization shattered something foundational inside her chest. Rowan rose slowly from his chair. Lillian. Do not. She pressed trembling fingers against her mouth. Please. Rowan stopped immediately, giving her space without leaving her alone. All this time, she whispered brokenly. I thought he simply stopped loving me after my mother died. Tears blurred her vision despite every desperate attempt to stop them. But he was already planning this while she was still alive. Rowan's expression darkened with something painfully close to regret. I am sorry. Lillian laughed weakly through tears she hated. Everyone keeps apologizing for things they did not do. She looked toward him finally. Meanwhile, the people who actually destroyed me never once said the word. Silence. Rowan moved closer carefully this time. Slow enough that she could step away if she wished. She did not. Listen to me. His voice lowered beneath the storm outside. None of this was your fault. The words struck deep because she realized suddenly nobody had ever said them before either. Not once. Rowan stood close enough now that she could see exhaustion beneath his calm expression too. Hours of investigation, confrontation, rage held tightly beneath discipline, all of it directed toward protecting her. Why? The question had begun haunting her more with every passing hour. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered again. Rowan looked at her for a long moment. Too long. Like deciding something internally. Finally he reached inside the inner pocket of his black coat and removed something small wrapped carefully in cloth. "Because," he said quietly, "you once saved someone I loved." Confusion crossed her face instantly. Rowan unfolded the cloth slowly. Inside rested a faded pale blue ribbon. Worn with age. Burned slightly along one edge. Lillian stared at it blankly for exactly 3 seconds before the memory slammed into her chest hard enough to steal breath from her lungs. Fire. Smoke. A frightened little boy trapped near the stables during a winter charity event years ago. She had been 14. "No," she whispered. Rowan's eyes never left hers. "You remember now." Her pulse hammered violently. "The Blackthorn Estate fire." Rowan nodded once. "My younger brother." The ribbon trembled slightly between his fingers beneath the candlelight. "You carried him out before the roof collapsed." Lillian stared at him in shock. "Your brother died 2 years later." Rowan's voice remained calm somehow. But he never forgot the girl who saved him. Silence wrapped tightly around the library. The fire crackled softly beside them while snow battered the manor windows beyond endless darkness. Rowan looked down briefly at the faded ribbon before lifting his eyes back to hers. "Neither did I." Lillian did not sleep again. This time it was not fear keeping her awake. It was memory. She sat beside the tall bedroom windows of the East Suite while dawn slowly bled silver across the frozen forests beyond Blackthorn Manor. Snow covered the cliffs and pine trees in endless white silence. Somewhere below, servants had already begun moving through the halls quietly preparing the manor for morning. But inside her room, time felt suspended between past and present. The ribbon still haunted her thoughts. Pale blue silk burned at one edge. A memory she had buried so deeply she almost believed it belonged to another life entirely. She had been 14 during the Blackthorn Estate fire. Her mother still alive. Her father still looking at her with warmth instead of avoidance. The memory arrived now in sharp fragments beneath the pale dawn light. Smoke. Shouting. A terrified little boy trapped near collapsing stables, while wealthy guests panicked safely across the lawn. She remembered running before anyone stopped her. Remembered dragging the crying child through smoke while sparks burned holes through her sleeves and ribbon. Then afterward, chaos swallowed everything. Doctors. Carriages. Her mother holding her tightly while servants rushed around the estate. She never learned the boy's name. Never knew Rowan Blackthorn had stood there watching the entire thing. A soft knock interrupted the silence. Before she answered, Mrs. Green entered carrying breakfast on a silver tray. "You should eat this time," the older woman said gently. Lillian almost smiled faintly. "Everyone in this manor treats me like I survived a war." Mrs. Green placed the tray carefully near the fire. "Perhaps because you did." The words settled heavily between them. Lillian looked toward the rising daylight outside again. "Did His Grace sleep at all?" Mrs. Green hesitated. "Not that anyone noticed." Unease curled softly through Lillian's chest. "Where is he?" "The West Office." Mrs. Green lowered her voice instinctively. 3 attorneys arrived before sunrise. Of course they had. Rowan Blackthorn did not strike Lillian as a man who delayed vengeance once he committed to it. "He has been working all night," Mrs. Green added quietly. "Nobody inside this house has seen him this angry in years." Lillian looked down at her hands. "Because of me." "No, Mrs." Green's eyes softened carefully. "Because someone hurt something he decided belonged under his protection." Heat rose unexpectedly into Lillian's face. She looked away too quickly. Mrs. Green noticed. Everyone inside this manor seemed to notice everything. "You should be careful with that man," the older woman said gently. "Why?" "Because His Grace does not know how to care about people halfway." Silence followed. Lillian suddenly understood why the servants feared Rowan so deeply. Men capable of enormous loyalty were often equally capable of enormous destruction once betrayed. 2 hours later, the entire city of New York exploded. Newspapers arrived at Blackthorn Manor before noon. So did rumors. By breakfast, financial columns began reporting irregularities tied to Ashford Holdings. By lunch, private banking firms quietly suspended partnerships connected to Vivian Ashford's accounts. By afternoon, society wives whispered about forged trust documents over champagne and tea. Rowan moved through all of it with terrifying calm. Lillian found him in the West office shortly after noon, standing beside a massive mahogany desk covered in legal files and newspaper clippings. Tall windows overlooked the frozen cliffs outside, while half a dozen attorneys worked silently around the room sorting evidence and contracts beneath candlelight. Every person stiffened slightly when Lillian entered. Rowan looked up immediately. His entire expression changed the moment he saw her. Softer. Not soft. Rowan Blackthorn would never truly look soft. But something inside the sharpness eased around the edges. "You should still be resting," he said quietly. Lillian glanced around the crowded office. "You appear busy dismantling my family." One corner of his mouth moved faintly. "Productive morning, yes?" She stepped closer carefully. "The newspapers are calling it financial fraud." Rowan signed one document without looking away from her. "That is because it is. Vivian will never recover socially from this." "Good." The answer came instantly. Calm. Cold. Several attorneys exchanged nervous glances before quickly returning to their paperwork. Lillian studied Rowan carefully across the desk. Dark coat. Rolled sleeves. Eyes shadowed with exhaustion he ignored entirely. He had not stopped working since last night. "You are frightening when focused." Rowan finally looked away from the documents completely. "Most people think so. Do you enjoy it?" Silence stretched briefly. "No," he set the pen down slowly. "I simply learned long ago that cruelty survives when nobody powerful interferes." The words felt personal somehow. Older than her. Before she could ask further, another knock interrupted them. Mr. Holloway entered carrying a folded telegram. "Your Grace." Rowan accepted it immediately. His eyes scanned the message once before his expression hardened sharply. "Interesting." Lillian's stomach tightened. "What happened?" Rowan handed the telegram toward her. "Emergency meeting requested. Ashford legal counsel willing to negotiate private settlement regarding beneficiary control and public statements." Vivian wanted settlement. Quiet settlement. Which meant she was desperate now. "She is frightened," Lillian whispered. Rowan's gaze remained icy. "She should be. What will you do?" "Nothing privately." He crossed toward the window overlooking the snowy grounds below. "Mrs. Ashford spent years silencing you behind closed doors." Rowan turned back slowly. "I have no interest in granting her secrecy now." The ruthlessness in his voice sent chills down Lillian's spine. Not because she disagreed. Because some small broken part of her still struggled to accept that someone could care enough to fight this hard on her behalf. Rowan noticed the hesitation immediately. "You are still trying to protect them." "I am trying to understand how this became my life in less than 24 hours. Silence followed. Rowan walked closer slowly. "Then understand this first." His gray eyes held hers steadily. "None of what happens next is your fault." The words landed differently now. More dangerous somehow because she wanted to believe them. Truly believe them. A sudden burst of laughter interrupted from the hallway outside before Oliver Blackthorn appeared uninvited through the office doors carrying 3 newspapers beneath one arm. "Congratulations," he announced casually. "Half the city believes Rowan has either adopted you, married you secretly, or declared war on Manhattan society." Several attorneys visibly pretended not to listen. Oliver dropped the newspapers onto the desk dramatically. "Personally, I prefer the marriage theory. It is more romantic." Rowan looked entirely unimpressed. "Why are you here?" "Entertainment." Oliver glanced toward Lillian with easy amusement. "Also because Aunt Beatrice has threatened to arrive personally unless someone explains why Rowan Blackthorn is suddenly destroying old aristocratic families before breakfast." Lillian blinked slightly. "You have an Aunt Beatrice?" Everyone unfortunate enough to survive long enough eventually acquires one. Rowan ignored him completely. Oliver. Fine. Oliver lifted both hands. Actual reason. There is someone downstairs asking for Miss Ashford. The room quieted immediately. Rowan's expression sharpened. Who? Oliver's amusement vanished entirely now. Her father. Silence crashed through the office. Lillian went cold instantly. Richard Ashford never came anywhere personally. Not unless forced. Rowan noticed the change in her breathing immediately. No, the word left him before she spoke. Lillian looked toward him sharply. You have not even heard what he wants. I do not care. His voice turned dangerously calm. He allowed this. The simple certainty of it hurt more because it was true. Oliver glanced awkwardly between them. He looks terrible, if that helps. Lillian closed her eyes briefly. Her father. Somewhere downstairs beneath this enormous manor. The man who once carried her on his shoulders through summer gardens before spending years pretending not to notice she was disappearing now waited asking to see her. Rowan stepped closer instantly. You do not owe him anything. I know. Then why do you look guilty? Lillian laughed softly without humor. Because children continue loving their parents long after they should stop. Something shifted painfully through Rowan's expression then. Understanding perhaps. He looked away first. I will not allow him to hurt you again. The promise settled heavily between them. Real. Absolute. Lillian believed him completely, which terrified her more than anything else. I need to speak with him, she whispered. Rowan's jaw tightened visibly. Lillian. Please. Silence stretched long enough that even Oliver stopped moving entirely. Finally Rowan exhaled slowly through his nose. Controlled. Reluctant. 10 minutes. His eyes locked onto hers. And I remain in the room. Relief and fear tangled painfully together inside her chest. Thank you. Rowan's expression remained unreadable. Do not thank me yet. 20 minutes later, Lillian stood outside the blue drawing room gripping the edge of Rowan's black coat around her shoulders, while her pulse hammered violently beneath her ribs. Voices murmured faintly inside. Her father's voice among them. Older somehow. Weaker. Rowan stood beside her in silence. Tall. Motionless. Dangerous enough that servants avoided even glancing toward the hallway. You can still refuse, he said quietly. Lillian stared at the closed doors ahead. No, Rowan studied her face carefully. You are shaking. I know. Before she could stop herself, her fingers found his sleeve briefly. Warm wool beneath trembling hands. Rowan went still instantly. Lillian realized what she had done and tried pulling away immediately. Rowan caught her hand gently before she could. Not controlling. Steadying. His thumb brushed lightly across her knuckles once. You are not alone in there, he said softly. Something inside her chest cracked open at the words. Rowan released her hand slowly afterward, but the warmth lingered painfully. Mr. Holloway opened the drawing room doors without a sound. Richard Ashford stood near the fireplace waiting. Older than she remembered. Grayer. Smaller somehow beneath the weight of exhaustion and public scandal already spreading through the city. The moment he saw her, his face broke completely. Lillian. Rowan stepped into the room directly beside her before the door even finished opening. Cold gray eyes fixed entirely on Richard Ashford. Protective. Watching. Waiting for the slightest wrong move. Her father noticed immediately. And for the first time in Lillian's life, Richard Ashford looked afraid of someone more than he feared his own failures. Richard Ashford looked at his daughter like a man staring at a ghost he personally buried years ago. Silence settled heavily through the blue drawing room while snow drifted softly beyond tall windows and firelight flickered gold across dark walls lined with blackthorn portraits. Lillian remained near the doorway wrapped in Rowan's black coat. Rowan stood beside her without speaking. Tall. Motionless. His presence filled the room so completely that Richard visibly struggled to hold eye contact longer than a few seconds at a time. Lillian, her father said again quietly. Please sit down. She did not move. Strange. She had spent years obeying automatically whenever he spoke, even after he stopped defending her. Yet standing beside Rowan somehow reminded her she no longer belonged to the frightened version of herself Ashford Manor created. Richard noticed that too. His shoulders sagged slightly. "You look like your mother." The words hit harder than expected. Lillian swallowed carefully. "That is the first thing you have said to me in months." Pain flickered across his face instantly. Genuine pain. Rowan remained perfectly still beside her, watching, measuring every expression crossing Richard Ashford's face with cold precision. "I deserve that," Richard admitted quietly. Lillian almost laughed at the understatement. Instead she looked toward the fire because meeting her father's eyes suddenly felt unbearable. "Why are you here?" Richard glanced briefly toward Rowan before answering. "I came to explain." Rowan's voice cut through the room calmly. "Be careful with that word." Richard stiffened slightly. Rowan stepped closer to the fireplace slowly. Explanation and excuse are often confused by weak men. Silence crashed down again. Richard looked exhausted suddenly. Not merely tired. Hollowed out. Like the last 24 hours finally stripped away the illusion that avoiding difficult choices protected anyone. "You hate me," he said softly to Lillian. She looked at him carefully then. Really looked at him for perhaps the first time in years. Gray threaded through his hair now. Deep lines carved around his mouth. Eyes older than she remembered. This was not the father from her childhood memories anymore. Not the man who once carried her through gardens while her mother laughed beside them beneath summer sunlight. That man disappeared slowly over years of silence and cowardice until only this remained. "No," she whispered finally. "That would have been easier." Richard closed his eyes briefly like the answer physically hurt. Rowan watched the exchange without interruption. Yet somehow his silence felt protective rather than distant. Lillian sensed him there constantly now. Steady. Immovable. Richard looked toward Rowan again uneasily. "Could we speak privately?" "No," Rowan answered immediately. "Your Grace. You lost the privilege of privacy when you failed her repeatedly behind closed doors." Richard's jaw tightened slightly. "This is between my daughter and me." Rowan's expression turned glacial. "No silence again. This became my concern the moment your daughter arrived at my estate bleeding." The room went very still afterward. Richard lowered his eyes briefly. Shame perhaps. Maybe simply exhaustion. "I failed her," he admitted quietly. Rowan's gaze sharpened faintly. "That is the first honest thing you have said since entering this room." Lillian looked toward the fire again because suddenly emotion tightened painfully inside her chest. She waited years to hear those words. Years. And somehow now that they finally existed aloud, they changed nothing. Richard sat down heavily near the fireplace. "When your mother became ill," he said quietly, "everything changed very quickly." Lillian said nothing. The business was collapsing already. His hands trembled faintly against his knees. Debt. Investors pulling out. The railroad expansion nearly destroyed us. Rowan crossed his arms slowly. "And so you decided stealing from your daughter was financially efficient." Richard flinched visibly. "It was not like that." "Then explain how it was." The coldness in Rowan's voice could have frozen water. Richard looked toward Lillian desperately instead. "I never wanted to hurt you." Her throat tightened sharply. "You watched it happen anyway." Silence. Richard looked suddenly smaller somehow. "Vivian believed strictness would prepare you for society." Rowan laughed softly then. The sound held absolutely no amusement inside it. "Interesting." Richard's face tightened. "You do not understand what she was like after Eleanor died." Lillian froze instantly at the sound of her mother's name spoken aloud. Rowan noticed. Of course he did. Richard continued quietly. "Lillian stopped speaking for months after the funeral." His voice cracked slightly. "She wandered through the house at night crying because she thought nobody could hear her." Pain spread slowly through Lillian's chest. She hated remembering that girl. Small. Broken. Grieving alone because everyone else seemed desperate to move on from the woman she lost. Vivian said discipline would help. Rowan's expression darkened dangerously. "And you believed humiliating a grieving child counted as discipline." Richard looked toward him sharply. "You think this is simple because you were not there." Rowan went completely still. No, he said quietly. I think it is simple because I know exactly what weak men become when they are frightened. Silence exploded through the room. Richard stared at him in shock. Rowan's eyes never changed. Cold silver beneath firelight. You chose comfort repeatedly over protecting your daughter. Every word landed cleanly. Precisely. Then convinced yourself helplessness was the same thing as kindness. Lillian felt tears sting unexpectedly behind her eyes again. Not because Rowan was cruel. Because he was right. Richard looked toward her desperately now. Lillian, I loved you. The words shattered something inside her quietly. Then why was I always alone? Silence. Long enough that the fire became painfully loud. Richard looked down at his hands. Because every time I tried to intervene, Vivian threatened to leave. Lillian stared at him blankly. What? Shame flooded visibly across his face now. The business was collapsing. Investors trusted her family connections. Society listened to her. He swallowed hard. I convinced myself keeping peace inside the house protected everyone. Rowan's expression became almost frighteningly calm. And your daughter paid the price. Richard closed his eyes briefly. Yes. The honesty hurt worse than denial somehow. Lillian wrapped Rowan's coat tighter around herself because suddenly cold crept through her chest again. Did you know about the trust before my mother died? Richard went still. Rowan's gaze sharpened instantly. Silence stretched long enough to become answer itself. God! Lillian whispered. Richard looked shattered now. Your grandfather believed I lacked the discipline to manage the estate after Eleanor passed. So you tried changing the beneficiary terms. I was desperate. Rowan stepped forward suddenly. Not fast. Somehow worse because every movement looked deliberate. Controlled. No, he said quietly. You were greedy. Richard stood abruptly. You know nothing about my marriage. Rowan's eyes darkened instantly. I know your daughter learned to apologize before speaking. The room froze. Rowan's voice lowered further. I know she hesitates before eating because she spent years wondering if food would be taken away. Another step closer. And I know she flinches whenever someone raises their voice. Silence crashed violently between them. Richard looked physically ill now. Rowan stopped directly in front of him. Tall enough to force the older man backward without touching him once. So no, Rowan said softly. I do not believe you loved her well enough. Lillian's breath caught sharply. Nobody had ever defended her this fiercely before. Nobody. Richard looked toward his daughter again with tears gathering visibly in his eyes now. I am sorry. The words sounded broken. Human. Real. Lillian wanted to feel triumph hearing them. Instead only grief remained. Grief for the father she lost long before tonight. I know, she whispered softly. Richard blinked in surprise. You do. Yes. Her voice trembled slightly. That is what makes it sad. Silence settled heavily through the drawing room. Rowan finally stepped back enough to give Richard space to breathe again, though the threat inside the room never disappeared entirely. Richard looked older now than when he arrived. Defeated, perhaps. Vivian will not survive this scandal, he said quietly. Rowan answered immediately. Good. Richard almost smiled bitterly at the certainty. You truly care about her. Rowan's expression did not change. Yes. The simple honesty stunned the entire room silent. Lillian's pulse stumbled painfully against her ribs. Richard looked between them slowly. Understanding spread across his exhausted face. I spent years watching my daughter disappear inside my own house, he said softly. And somehow you noticed her in a single evening. Rowan's eyes shifted briefly toward Lillian then. Something almost painfully gentle moved beneath the coldness there. No, he said quietly. I noticed her years ago. Silence. Heavy. Endless silence. Lillian stared at him in shock. Rowan held her gaze steadily now. No retreat. No avoidance. I looked for you after the fire, he admitted softly. For months. Her breath caught. What? My brother would not stop talking about the girl with the blue ribbon who carried him through smoke. A faint shadow crossed Rowan's expression. Then your mother died and you disappeared from society almost entirely. Lillian's throat tightened painfully. Rowan took one slow step toward her. I saw you again at charity functions over the years. Another step. At opera houses, ballrooms, gardens. His voice lowered. Always standing alone. Tears blurred her vision before she could stop them. Rowan's gray eyes never left hers. And every single time, he said quietly, someone beside you looked careless with something precious. The room disappeared around them suddenly. The fire, Richard, the storm outside. All of it faded beneath the weight of Rowan finally speaking aloud what had been living silently beneath every glance and every act of protection since the night he found her in the snow. Lillian looked at him helplessly. Why did you never say anything? Pain flickered briefly across his face then. Real pain. Because by the time I realized I wanted to, Rowan said softly, you already looked too broken to trust anyone. Tears slipped down Lillian's cheeks silently. She hated crying. Hated it. Yet Rowan stepped closer anyway instead of away. Careful. Gentle in a way she suspected very few people ever witnessed from him. I should have taken you away from that house sooner, he whispered. The words shattered her completely. Not because they were dramatic. Because nobody had ever sounded devastated by failing to protect her before. Lillian began crying quietly then. Real tears this time. Years of grief and humiliation and loneliness finally breaking loose beneath candlelight while Rowan Blackthorne stood close enough to catch her if she fell. Richard Ashford looked away first. Like he understood suddenly that whatever existed between his daughter and the dangerous man standing beside her now had already become stronger than anything fear or society could undo. For nights later, the Winter Foundation Ball stopped breathing the moment Lillian Ashford entered the room beside Rowan Blackthorne. Crystal chandeliers burned above the grand ballroom like captured stars while a string quartet faltered visibly halfway through a measure beneath the weight of sudden silence. Hundreds of guests turned at once. Politicians, heiresses, banking families, old money wrapped in silk and diamonds. Every conversation collapsed instantly. Lillian felt it happen physically. Shock moving through the room like a wave. Rowan had warned her society would watch. He had not explained what it felt like becoming the center of an entire city's attention all at once. The ballroom glittered gold beneath candlelight and winter roses. Women wore gowns worth more than most annual salaries. Men clustered beside marble columns whispering behind crystal glasses and polished smiles. Yet none of them looked at the decorations for long. They looked only at her. Or rather at the impossible sight of Rowan Blackthorne escorting her publicly through the center of Manhattan society like something precious he had no intention of surrendering. Rowan's hand rested lightly against the small of her back beneath the dark silver silk of her gown. Steady, warm, possessive enough that nobody dared approach too closely. Breathe, he murmured quietly beside her. Lillian realized suddenly she had stopped. Heat rushed softly into her cheeks. This was a terrible idea. Rowan's gray eyes remained fixed ahead as they descended the ballroom staircase together. No. Everyone is staring. Good. The simple certainty in his voice settled something trembling inside her chest. Lillian wore silver tonight. Not pale, fragile silver like the ruined gown from Ashford Manor. This dress shimmered like winter moonlight beneath crystal chandeliers. Darker. Richer. Designed deliberately to make people look twice. Diamonds rested at her throat borrowed from the Blackthorne family vaults according to Oliver, who spent an alarming amount of time complaining dramatically while helping select jewelry 2 hours earlier. Mrs. Green cried quietly when Lillian walked downstairs. Oliver declared Rowan looked homicidal the moment other men noticed her. Neither reaction particularly helped calm her nerves. Do not look frightened, Rowan said softly beside her. I am frightened. For the first time all evening, something faintly amused touched his expression. Excellent. Lillian blinked up at him. Excuse me? Fear keeps people honest. Before she could answer, the crowd ahead parted abruptly. Senator Whitmore approached first with his wife beside him dressed in emerald silk. Unlike the whispering guests surrounding them, the senator looked openly pleased. Your Grace. He nodded respectfully toward Rowan before turning warmly toward Lillian. Miss Ashford. You look remarkably well considering you set half the city on fire this week. Lillian nearly laughed. Rowan looked entirely unimpressed. Senator. Eleanor Whitmore appeared moments later behind her husband carrying champagne and obvious amusement. There she is. Her sharp gray eyes swept over Lillian approvingly. Good. You finally stopped looking apologetic for existing. Rowan accepted 2 champagne glasses from a passing waiter before handing one toward Lillian automatically. Their fingers brushed briefly. Familiar warmth moved quietly through her chest now instead of panic. Dangerous how quickly she had become accustomed to him. Eleanor noticed everything immediately. Of course she did. Interesting, she murmured softly into her own champagne. Rowan ignored her. Again. Music resumed gradually around them while conversations reignited across the ballroom in cautious whispers. Everywhere Lillian looked, people stared openly. Some curious, some judgmental, some calculating. Yet none approached with cruelty. Rowan's presence prevented it. Men feared him too much. Women feared becoming the target of his cold attention even more. They are trying to decide what you are to me, Rowan said quietly. Lillian's pulse stumbled slightly. And what answer are they reaching? His gaze lowered briefly toward her face. The intelligent ones already know. Heat touched her cheeks again before she looked away too quickly. Dangerous man. Across the ballroom, movement near the marble staircase caught her attention suddenly. Vivian Ashford had arrived. The room shifted subtly the moment society noticed her too. Whispering intensified instantly beneath the music. Vivian descended the staircase alone tonight. No Clara beside her. No laughing social circle orbiting nearby. The scandal destroyed too much too quickly. Even from across the ballroom, Lillian could see strain beneath the perfect makeup and emerald silk. Vivian still looked beautiful. She simply no longer looked untouchable. Rowan noticed the moment Lillian saw her. Do you wish to leave? No, the answer surprised even her. Rowan studied her carefully. Then slowly, approval darkened softly through his expression. Good. Vivian approached eventually because pride would never allow retreat in public. Conversations quieted around her path. Watching. Waiting. Rowan remained completely calm beside Lillian while society practically held its breath. Your Grace, Vivian said smoothly once she stopped before them. Rowan inclined his head minimally. Mrs. Ashford. Vivian's eyes shifted toward Lillian. Sharp. Assessing. You look well. Lillian met her gaze steadily. I am. Silence stretched briefly. Vivian's smile tightened. How fortunate. Rowan stepped slightly closer beside Lillian then. Barely noticeable movement. Impossible to misunderstand. Was there something you required? Vivian looked toward him carefully. I wish to congratulate Miss Ashford on her sudden social success. The insult beneath the elegance hung sharply in the air. Lillian opened her mouth before Rowan spoke first. Interesting. His voice remained calm. I assumed you came to apologize publicly. The nearby guests froze instantly. Vivian's composure flickered. Your Grace. You struck her publicly. Rowan's gray eyes turned glacial beneath the chandeliers. Surely basic manners suggest correcting humiliation the same way. The silence surrounding them became absolute. Lillian saw several society wives openly staring now. Men pretending not to listen while clearly hearing every word. Vivian realized it too. For the first time in years, she stood trapped in the exact kind of public scrutiny she once used against Lillian so effortlessly. I do not believe this is the appropriate setting. Rowan's expression never changed. No. A pause. You seemed comfortable enough with public cruelty 4 nights ago. Vivian went pale. Lillian felt her heartbeat hammer painfully beneath her ribs. Rowan did not look angry. Somehow that made him infinitely more terrifying. You are enjoying this, Vivian whispered sharply. Rowan's eyes darkened slightly. No, his voice lowered. I simply promised someone she would never stand alone in a room again. The words shattered straight through Lillian's chest. Vivian saw it happen. Fury flashed instantly across her face before she smoothed it away again. Too late. Society noticed weakness now. Very well, Vivian said coldly. Then slowly, deliberately, She turned toward Lillian. The entire ballroom watched. I regret, Vivian said carefully through clenched dignity, that our family disagreements became public. Not apology. Never apology. Rowan looked entirely unimpressed. But beside him, something inside Lillian shifted quietly. She no longer needed genuine remorse from the woman who hurt her. That realization felt strangely freeing. Thank you, Lillian said softly. Vivian stared at her in confusion. That is all. Lillian held her gaze steadily. You do not control me anymore. Silence. Vivian looked almost startled by the calm certainty in her voice. Then slowly, the older woman understood the truth sitting quietly beneath the words. Lillian no longer feared losing love she never truly had. Vivian stepped backward first. Retreat disguised as elegance. Enjoy your evening. Rowan's voice stopped her before she could leave fully. One more thing. Vivian turned sharply. Rowan's expression became pure winter beneath the chandeliers. If you ever raise your hand toward Miss Ashford again, there will not be enough lawyers in Manhattan to protect you from what follows. No raised voice. No dramatic threat. Somehow every person nearby looked chilled anyway. Vivian left immediately afterward. The ballroom remained silent several seconds after her departure before conversations exploded again louder than before. Scandal. Gossip. Shock. But beneath all of it, something else spread too. Respect. Society watched Rowan Blackthorne stand beside Lillian Ashford publicly and understood exactly what it meant. She was protected now. Chosen. The realization moved through the room with almost visible force. Lillian exhaled shakily once Vivian disappeared into the crowd. I think I may faint. Rowan looked down at her immediately. You are doing very well. The quiet sincerity in his voice nearly undid her more than the confrontation itself. Music shifted suddenly across the ballroom as the orchestra began a slower waltz beneath glittering chandeliers. Couples drifted toward the dance floor in elegant waves of silk and black coats. Rowan's attention remained fixed entirely on Lillian. Dance with me. Her pulse stumbled hard. Your Grace. Rowan. The correction came softly this time, intimate beneath the ballroom noise surrounding them. Lillian looked up slowly. Rowan extended one gloved hand toward her. The exact same gesture he offered in the snow outside Ashford Manor 4 nights earlier. Except now the entire city watched. Lillian. Her name sounded different from him now. Not command. Not request. Something quieter. More dangerous. Choice. Slowly, she placed her hand into his. Warmth closed around her instantly again. Familiar now. Safe now. The ballroom seemed to disappear the moment Rowan led her onto the dance floor beneath crystal light and whispering society voices. Music swelled softly around them while his hand settled carefully at her waist. Close enough to feel steady heat through layers of silk. You are trembling, he murmured. I blame you entirely. Something almost resembling a smile touched his mouth then. Rare enough to feel precious. They moved together slowly across polished marble while hundreds of eyes followed them. Yet for the first time in years, Lillian did not feel invisible beneath attention. She felt seen. Rowan guided her effortlessly through the waltz. Controlled. Certain. Every movement precise enough to make the rest of the ballroom disappear around them piece by piece. You are staring at me? She whispered softly. Yes. Why? Rowan's gray eyes held hers beneath the chandeliers. Because you finally stopped looking like you expect the world to apologize for your existence. Emotion tightened painfully in her throat again. You did that. His hand at her waist tightened slightly. No, the music swelled around them while winter snow drifted softly beyond towering ballroom windows. You survived long enough for someone to notice. Tears threatened again. Lillian laughed weakly beneath them. You make that sound heroic. Rowan looked at her like the answer should have been obvious. It was. The honesty nearly stole breath from her lungs. Around them, society continued spinning beneath gold light and music and whispered scandal. Yet none of it mattered suddenly. Not the gossip. Not the staring. Not the years she spent shrinking herself to survive. Rowan's gaze never left her face as they moved together beneath the chandeliers. There is something I need to ask you, he said quietly. Her heartbeat quickened instantly. What? Rowan slowed their movement gradually until they stood nearly still in the center of the ballroom while couples continued circling around them. Dangerous. Intimate. Every eye watching. Come home with me, he said softly. Lillian blinked in confusion. I already live at Blackthorn Manor. No, his expression changed slightly then. Less Duke. Less ruthless power. More man than she had ever seen him become before. I mean permanently. Her breath caught sharply. Rowan stepped closer beneath the music. I spent years watching people treat you like something temporary. His voice lowered further. I am asking if you would allow me to spend the rest of my life proving otherwise. The ballroom disappeared completely then. Lillian stared at him while her heart broke and healed simultaneously inside her chest. Rowan. His thumb brushed lightly against her waist beneath silver silk. Careful. Reverent almost. You do not have to answer tonight. Yes, she whispered before he finished speaking. Rowan went still. Completely still. Yes. Tears blurred her vision softly beneath crystal chandeliers and winter light. Yes. For the first time since she met him, Rowan Blackthorn looked genuinely shaken. Like the answer mattered enough to wound him. The realization felt unbearably beautiful. Around them, society gasped quietly as the feared Duke of Blackthorn lowered his forehead gently against Lillian Ashford's beneath the center of the ballroom floor like the rest of the world no longer existed. Good, he whispered softly. Warmth and relief and something dangerously close to love moved through his voice all at once. Then Rowan lifted his head slightly and looked directly at every person watching them beneath the chandeliers of Manhattan society. Cold enough to silence the entire room instantly. Protective enough to rewrite her life forever. And with one hand still holding Lillian's against his heart, the most feared man in New York chose her publicly where everyone could see.